Hey guys, tonight we are travelling back to a time and place where survival itself was the greatest of all sagas. Imagine standing on a wind-scoured hill, the sky above you a bruised sheet of grey, and the air so cold it feels like a physical weight against your skin. You see, we're not just visiting medieval Scotland, we're about to endure one of its winters. This isn't the romantic tartan-clad vision from a shortbread tin. This is a world of biting hunger, suffocating darkness, and a cold so profound it settles deep in your bones and stays there for months. Honestly, with your current gear, probably a cosy hoodie and some sweatpants, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I love seeing where you're all tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the light. It's not just fading, it's failing. The sun, which has been a reluctant visitor for weeks, now barely musters the strength to climb above the distant slate-coloured hills before beginning its retreat. It's late afternoon, but the quality of the light feels like a deep and final twilight. The vibrant greens and purples of the heather have surrendered to a monotonous palette of rust and dun. The world is being bleached of its colour, drained of its warmth, all in preparation for the long sleep. You stand on a rough track, little more than a pair of ruts carved into the peat, and pull your thin cloak tighter. It's a useless gesture. A new kind of wind is making its presence known. This isn't the playful breeze of summer or the blustery gust of early autumn. This is a wind with teeth. It finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin, and it bites with a chilling malice. It carries the scent of damp earth, of rotting leaves, and something else. The clean, sharp, sterile smell of ice. You've been walking for hours, following the line of a shallow, fast-moving stream. A burn, they call it here. The landscape is vast, empty, and intimidating. There are no friendly fences, no neat patchworks of fields. There are just rolling, treeless moors that stretch to a horizon blurred by a gathering mist. Here and there, a gnarled and wind-tormented birch tree clings to the bank of the burn, its last few yellow leaves shivering violently before letting go. They don't spiral gracefully to the ground. They're snatched by the wind and whipped away into the grey expanse. Looking around, you realise how utterly alone you are. There's no helpful signpost, no friendly farmer on a tractor to wave at. In fact, you haven't seen another soul since the sun was at its weak zenith. This is the reality of much of medieval Scotland, particularly in the Highlands. It wasn't a land of bustling villages like in England, but of scattered farmsteads, or firm tuns, often housing just a few extended families. The distance between you and your nearest neighbour could be a hard day's walk, a journey that will soon become impossible. A flock of birds, maybe fieldfares, bursts from a thicket of gorse, their calls sharp and panicked as they hurry south. The local creatures know what's coming. You, on the other hand, are just beginning to understand. Every breath you draw is a tiny sharp pain in your lungs. Your fingers are numb, your ears are burning, and a deep, unshakable chill is beginning to set in. This is the moment of transition, the turning of the great wheel. In the old tongue, this time of year is Samhain, a liminal space between the harvest and the dark, when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits is at its thinnest. People you might meet later would tell you this is why the wind sounds like it's whispering names. As a fun little fringe belief, some would even carry a piece of iron or a sprig of rowan wood to keep the more mischievous fairies at bay, who are thought to be particularly active in this dying light. The track you're on begins to descend into a shallow glen. The wind is slightly less ferocious here, but the air feels heavier, colder. You can see your own breath now, a thick white plume that is instantly torn to shreds. Historians still argue whether the fierce, independent clan system, so famous in later centuries, was fully established everywhere in this period. In many places, society was likely a more complex web of loyalties, with families bound by kinship and obligation, not just to a chief, but to a powerful local lord, or even a distant king whose authority barely reached these isolated corners. But whatever the formal structure, the only law that will truly matter for the next 5 months is the law of winter, and you are about to become its subject. Ahead, in the deepest part of the gloom, you see it. A flicker. A tiny, unsteady spark of orange light. It's impossibly small against the crushing immensity of the landscape, but it's a sign of life. It's the promise of a roof, a fire, and a temporary reprieve from the cold that is already gnawing at you. With a surge of desperate energy, you quicken your pace, your feet stumbling on the uneven ground as you head towards that fragile beacon, knowing, with a dreadful certainty, that this is only the very beginning. That tiny spark of orange is your entire world now. It's a pinprick of hope in an overwhelming darkness, and you stumble towards it, your legs stiff and clumsy with cold. The wind seems to be trying to push you back, to trip you up, to throw you down into the rough heather, where you might just give up and let the cold take you. You have to understand that this chill you're feeling isn't just a bad weather front. It's not an unusually harsh November. You have unknowingly walked into a particularly brutal phase of a global phenomenon, the Little Ice Age. This isn't just a story about a medieval winter. It's a story about one of the worst winters during a multi-century cold snap that gripped the planet. Starting around the 14th century and lasting well into the 19th, this period saw global temperatures drop significantly. Glaciers in the Alps advanced, swallowing entire villages. The River Thames in London froze over so solidly that people held sprawling frost fairs on its surface. And here, in Scotland, perched on the windswept northern edge of Europe, the effects were devastating. As you draw closer to the light, the ground under your feet changes. What was soft, springy peat is now becoming hard, the moisture in the soil beginning to freeze solid. Your footsteps make a brittle, crunching sound. A few delicate white specks begin to drift past your face. At first you think it's just ash from the fire ahead, but then another lands on the dark wool of your sleeve and you see it for what it is, a perfectly formed, six-pointed snowflake. And then another and another. It's a gentle, almost beautiful start to something that will become a monstrous force. The people you are about to meet have no concept of climatology or global temperature shifts. They just know that the world has become a colder, harder place than it was for their grandparents. Their historical fact is the lived experience of it. They know that the growing season for their oats and barley has become perilously short. They know that the high summer pastures, once reliable, can now be hit by freak snowstorms. They've seen harvests fail not once but several years in a row, leading to what was known as the Great Famine in the early 1300s, a catastrophe that starved millions across Europe and was a grim preview of the Little Ice Age's power. Their explanations for this deepening cold are rooted in faith and fear. A priest might tell you it's God's displeasure, a punishment for the sins of mankind. Others, in hushed tones around the fire, would blame it on witchcraft or a pact made with a dark entity by a rival clan. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some chronicles written by monks tried to link these terrible winters to celestial events, a comet seen years earlier, a solar eclipse, or strange lights in the sky were all considered potential omens or even direct causes of the subsequent suffering. There was no scientific explanation, only a search for meaning in a world that felt increasingly hostile. You think your weather app is a bit dramatic when it predicts a storm. Their long-range forecast was based on the behaviour of birds, the thickness of moss on the north side of a rock, and a deep-seated feeling of dread in their bones. You are now close enough to make out the source of the light. It's a low, long building, hunkered down into the earth as if trying to hide from the wind. It has no sharp angles, its turf and stone walls rounded and soft-edged, looking more like a natural feature of the landscape than a human construction. The light isn't coming from a window. There are no windows. It's spilling from a low doorway, a warm, smoky, living glow that contrasts sharply with the sterile white of the falling snow. The debate among historians and climate scientists continues to this day. Historians still argue whether the primary trigger for the Little Ice Age was a cluster of massive volcanic eruptions spewing sun-blocking ash into the atmosphere, a prolonged dip in solar activity known as a solar minimum, or a complex feedback loop involving ocean currents and Arctic sea ice. Whatever the cause, the result is this. You are standing in the middle of a climate crisis, armed with nothing but a wool cloak and the desperate hope that the people in that hut will let you in. The snow is coming faster now, no longer drifting but driving, stinging your cheeks and sticking to your eyelashes. The world is dissolving into a swirling vortex of white and grey. The wind howls over the roof of the low building, creating a mournful, flute-like sound. You've heard of people getting lost in a blizzard just feet from their own door, and you can now see how easily that could happen. The sheer physical pressure of the cold is immense. It's a constant draining assault on your body's resources. You think your heating bill is painful. Imagine the labour of cutting and drying enough peat from the bog all summer and autumn, just to have a fighting chance of not freezing to death before the Yule feast. You stumble the last few yards, your boots skidding on the now icy stones near the entrance. The smell hits you first, a thick complex aroma of wood smoke, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and cooked meat. It's the smell of life, raw and unfiltered. You raise a numb hand to push aside the heavy hide flap that serves as a door, pausing for a moment on the threshold, a refugee from the burgeoning storm, about to trade the vast impersonal cold of the Ice Age for the close, complicated warmth of the hearth. You push the heavy, greasy hide aside and duck into the Longhouse. The change is instantaneous and overwhelming. You step from the howling, blizzard-whipped emptiness into a wall of heat, smoke, and sound. For a moment, you are blind. Your eyes, accustomed to the stark white of the snow, can't process the deep, firelit gloom. The air is so thick with smoke from the central hearth that your first breath is a cough, your eyes immediately starting to sting and water. It's like walking into a barbecue pit during a rainstorm. The smell is a complex assault on your modern sensibilities. The sharp, acrid tang of peat smoke, the earthy scent of the packed dirt floor, the unmistakable aroma of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and, underlying it all, the warm, pungent smell of livestock. This isn't just a house, it's a human and animal ark, sealed against the storm. As your eyes adjust, the scene resolves itself into a living tableau worthy of an old master's painting. The space is a single, long room, with a low roof supported by thick, smoke-blackened timbers. The walls are not smooth, but rough and uneven, a testament to their construction. This is a classic wattle and daub building. Its skeleton is a lattice of woven hazel or willow branches, the wattle, which is then slathered inside and out with a thick mixture of clay, mud, straw and animal dung, the daub. It's a surprisingly effective insulator, but it's not exactly airtight, and you can feel a faint ghostly draft snaking around your ankles. You see movement in the flickering orange light. A woman near the central fire looks up from the pot she's stirring, her expression wary. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, stops his work mending a leather strap and squints at you. A cluster of children, silent and wide-eyed, peer at you from a shadowy corner. Your arrival has frozen the room. The low murmur of conversation has ceased. All eyes are on you, the stranger who has literally blown in with the storm. There's a tense moment where your fate hangs in the balance. You're an unknown, a potential threat, another mouth to feed in a season where every mouthful is precious. But the law of hospitality in these isolated communities is a sacred and practical thing. Turning away a traveller on a night like this is a death sentence, and to inflict that would bring bad luck and shame upon the household. The old man gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The woman ladles something from her pot into a rough wooden bowl. The tension breaks. You are, for now, accepted. It's only then that you become fully aware of your other roommates. At the far end of the Longhouse, in the deepest shadows beyond the firelight, there is a soft shuffling, a low grunt, and the sweet, grassy smell of cud being chewed. The family's most precious possessions are in here with you. A couple of thin, hairy-looking cattle and a small huddle of sheep are bedded down on a thick layer of bracken and heather. This historical fact of life was a matter of pure pragmatism. Leaving valuable livestock outside in a winter like this would be madness. They would freeze, be taken by wolves, or be stolen by desperate raiders from a neighbouring settlement. Bringing them inside the Longhouse, often at the byre end of the dwelling, provided them with shelter. In return, their collective body heat contributed significantly to the warmth of the single shared living space. It's the original central heating system, just a bit smellier, and occasionally prone to mooing at 3 a.m. As you gratefully accept the offered bowl, you notice that the smoke, while irritating, is not without its purpose. This is a quirky, yet vital feature of the design. Hanging from the rafters, almost invisible in the gloom, are sides of meat and strings of fish, slowly being cured and preserved by the constant fug of peat smoke. It also helped to waterproof the thatched roof over time, sealing it with a layer of tarry creosote, and kept the insect population down in the warmer months. You can't help but think it's a brilliant system if you can get past the constant feeling that you're slowly being smoked yourself, You find a spot on a low bench near the wall, the packed earth cold even through your thin shoes. The privacy you take for granted is completely absent. Every whisper, every cough, every rustle of movement is a public event. Historians still argue whether living in such close enforced proximity, sharing breath, warmth, and sleeping space with family and farm animals, created an incredibly tight-knit, psychologically resilient communal unit, or if it was a breeding ground for relentless stress, simmering resentments, and bitter conflicts that would only erupt once the spring thaw allowed for escape. Looking at the wary faces around you, you suspect the answer is probably both. For tonight, though, you're just grateful to be out of the wind, even if it means sharing your bedroom with a sheep who seems to be staring at you with profound suspicion. You sit hunched on the bench, cradling the warm wooden bowl in your numb hands. The contents are a thick greyish porridge of oats, maybe with some beans or mashed up root vegetables thrown in. It's bland, but it's hot, and the warmth radiates through the wood into your palms, a small miracle of thermal transfer that feels more comforting than a roaring fire. Your focus, and the focus of everyone in the Longhouse, is drawn to the centre of the room. Here, in a shallow, clay-lined pit, burns the hearth. This isn't the grand, stone-carved fireplace of a castle. This is a simple, functional fire that is the absolute, non-negotiable heart of this entire world. It is your sun and your moon now that the real ones have abandoned you. It provides all the heat, all the light, and the means to cook every meal. To let it go out is not just an inconvenience, it is a catastrophe. Maintaining this flame is a constant, laborious chore. You watch as the woman who gave you the food gets up and carefully places another block of peat onto the embers. It's a dense, dark brown brick cut from a bog during the summer months and then stacked and dried for weeks. This is the primary fuel for many in the Highlands and Islands. Wood was often scarce in these deforested landscapes, so peat, or turf as it was called, was the essential resource. It burns with a slow, smouldering heat and produces that signature, acrid smoke that fills the room. Getting this fuel wasn't a simple trip to the store. The entire family, including the children, would spend long, back-breaking days in the summer, cutting the wet, heavy sods with a special spade called a tusker. Then it had to be transported, stacked in such a way that the wind could dry it, and finally brought home to be stored in a dry place. The size of your peat stack was a direct measure of your wealth and your chances of seeing the spring. A small stack was a death warrant. The light it gives off is alive. It flickers and dances, throwing huge distorted shadows against the wattle and daub walls. The faces of your companions seem to shift and change in the unsteady glow, one moment looking like stern, carved effigies, the next appearing soft and vulnerable. This constant living light is all you have. There are no candles here. Wax was a luxury reserved for the church and the very wealthy. The only other source of light might be a rushlight, a humble but ingenious invention. You see one resting on a ledge, a common rush reed, peeled carefully to leave a single supporting strip of green skin, then dipped repeatedly in any available animal fat or grease. When lit, it would burn for maybe 15 to 30 minutes with a feeble, smoky, and distinctly smelly flame. A quirky tidbit is the existence of rushlight holders, simple iron clips on a stand, which are now prized as folk art. For the family here, it was just a piece of essential tech, allowing someone to move a tiny pool of light away from the main hearth, to mend a tool or tend to a child in the darkness. This central hearth is also a major health hazard. Look up. There is no chimney. A small hole in the thatched roof, often directly above the fire, is the only exit for the smoke. On a calm night it works, after a fashion. A column of smoke rises more or less straight up. But on a night like this, with the blizzard howling outside, the wind is a malevolent force. It presses down on the smoke hole, forcing the thick, choking clouds back down into the living space. The air quality is, to put it mildly, appalling. Modern studies of similar environments show dangerously high levels of carbon monoxide and particulates. This historical fact is evidenced in skeletal remains from the period, which often show signs of chronic respiratory diseases. The constant winter cough you hear from the old man isn't just a cold, it's a symptom of a lifetime spent breathing in this toxic soup. You find yourself instinctively ducking your head lower, trying to find a pocket of clearer air closer to the floor. As the fire settles, a man takes a long hollowed-out elder branch and, putting one end to his lips, blows a steady stream of air into the base of the embers, coaxing them back to a brighter glow. It's a human bellows, simple and effective. The effort of keeping this fire alive dictates the rhythm of the day, or what passes for a day in this endless night. Someone must always be awake, or at least conscious enough to feed the beast. The responsibility would be shared, with shifts taken through the long hours of darkness. Historians still argue whether the specific design of the smoke hole in different regions was a matter of cultural tradition, or a sophisticated, if unwritten, understanding of aerodynamics shaped by local wind conditions. Was a hole offset from the centre better than one directly above? Did a turf-lined lum or canopy offer any real advantage? For you, sitting in the thick of it, the debate seems academic. All you know is that this fire is a demanding, life-giving tyrant. It is your shield against the ice-toothed monster clawing at the walls, but it demands its tribute of fuel, effort, and the very air you breathe. Now that the immediate life-threatening chill has subsided, you become aware of a more personal discomfort. You are damp, not just your cloak, which is soaked from the snow, but everything. A deep, penetrating dampness seems to have settled into your very clothes, making them feel heavy and cold against your skin. You look down at your own attire, and then at the clothes of the family around the fire. Everyone is dressed in shades of brown, grey and faded green, the colours of the landscape itself. Your wardrobe here is almost exclusively wool, the material of choice. A historical fact for rich and poor alike in Northern Europe was wool. But this is not the soft, fine merino wool of your favourite sweater. This is a coarse, rough, and incredibly greasy material. The sheep you share the Longhouse with are not the fluffy white creatures of a petting zoo. They are a hardier, scrawnier breed, with a fleece that is thick, shaggy, and loaded with lanolin, the natural grease produced by sheep. This lanolin was the secret to survival. While it made the wool feel oily and a bit smelly, it also made it highly water-resistant. A well-made woolen cloak or tunic could shed a surprising amount of rain and snow, keeping the wearer's inner layers from getting completely soaked. The process of turning this fleece into clothing was a year-round task for the women of the household. They would shear the sheep, clean and card the wool, spin it into yarn using a simple drop spindle, and then weave it into cloth on a vertical warp-weighted loom. The colours were derived from local plants: yellow from weld, green from birch leaves, brown from onion skins or walnut shells. It was a technology of self-sufficiency. You look at what you're wearing, a simple tunic and leggings, all made of this same homespun wool. It's itchy, everywhere. The constant friction of the coarse fibres against your skin is a low-level torment you just have to get used to, and there's no escape. You don't have a separate set of pyjamas. You sleep in the same clothes you wear during the day, maybe just loosening a belt and taking off your shoes. This is partly for warmth, and partly because you don't own many clothes. A typical person might have 1 or 2 sets of these woolen garments, and that's it. There's no closet full of options. Laundry, as you know it, doesn't exist. Clothes might be occasionally beaten against a rock in a stream during the summer, but in winter that's impossible. The best you can do is hang a garment near the fire to dry out and hope the smoke kills some of the bacteria and lice. That's right, lice and fleas. They are a constant, unwelcome companion, thriving in the seams of your perpetually worn, greasy woolen clothes. You see the woman next to you casually scratch her arm, a gesture so common it goes unnoticed. A quirky and rather unpleasant tidbit is that delousing was a social activity. Families would sit by the fire and groom each other, picking the parasites from hair and clothing. It was a practical necessity, a form of intimacy born from a shared misery. It sounds revolting to you, but here it's just another part of the daily routine, as normal as eating or sleeping. Underneath the wool tunic you might have a linen shirt or shift if you were moderately well off. Linen, made from the flax plant, was softer and more comfortable against the skin, but it lacked wool's insulating properties and was laborious to produce. For many of the poorer folk it was wool on bare skin, day in, day out. On your feet you have simple leather turn shoes, made from a single piece of hide stitched together and turned inside out. They are soaked through, and you know that if you take them off, they will freeze solid overnight. The trick is to stuff them with dry grass or moss to help absorb the moisture and keep their shape. Historians still argue whether the famous Scottish tartan, or plaid, was a widespread reality in this period. While patterned cloth certainly existed, the idea of specific named clan tartans is largely a much later invention, romanticised in the 18th and 19th centuries. In your time, a weaver might create a pattern they liked using the available dyes, a district check perhaps, but you wouldn't identify a man's family allegiance by the specific squares on his cloak. He's just a guy from the glen who happens to be wearing a stripy blanket. The dampness is the real enemy. Because the Longhouse is so full of breathing bodies, human and animal, and a steaming cooking pot, the air inside is humid. This moisture-laden air, combined with the cold drafts snaking in through the walls, means that condensation is everywhere. The walls feel slick and cold to the touch. Your bedding, likely a pile of bracken or a straw-filled mattress, will absorb this moisture and feel perpetually clammy. This environment is a perfect breeding ground for mould and mildew. The constant dampness combined with the cold leaches the heat from your body relentlessly. It contributes to aches and pains, what they would call the rheums, and makes you feel colder than the actual air temperature would suggest. You huddle closer to the fire, but it's a futile effort. The front of your body roasts while your back, just inches away, feels like a block of ice. This is your uniform for the next 5 months. A damp, itchy, greasy, louse-infested cocoon of wool, your only and imperfect shield against the brutal Scottish winter. The simple porridge you finished was a welcome, if unexciting, start. But now, as the hide flap over the door rattles under the assault of the wind, the woman once again turns her attention to the main pot over the fire. It's time for the evening meal, the one substantial meal of the day. You watch, your stomach rumbling with a mixture of hunger and trepidation, as she pulls a chunk of dark, stringy-looking meat from a barrel in the corner and adds it to the pot. Welcome to the medieval Scottish winter diet, an exercise in monotony, preservation, and making do. Your pantry, if you can call it that, is a collection of barrels, sacks, and hanging meats, stored in the smoky gloom of the Longhouse. There are no fresh vegetables, there is no fresh fruit. The harvest is a distant memory, and the ground outside is frozen solid. Everything you will eat for the next several months was harvested, hunted, or slaughtered back in the autumn. And the primary weapon against decay, the single most important ingredient in your larder, is salt. The meat. The woman is cooking has been heavily salted or brined in a cask for weeks. The fish you see hanging from the rafters have been salted and air-dried until they are as hard as boards. This historical fact of preservation was a matter of life and death. Without effective methods to stop food from rotting, a community would starve before the winter was half over. Salt was so crucial that access to it, either from coastal salt pans where seawater was evaporated or through expensive trade, was of immense strategic importance. The result of all this preservation is a diet that is overwhelmingly, relentlessly salty. The meat, likely mutton or beef from a cow that was too old or weak to survive the winter, has to be soaked for hours to draw out the worst of the salt before it's even remotely edible. Even then, it's tough and has a sharp, tangy flavour that masks any of the meat's original taste. The fish, often herring or cod, is similarly harsh. You'd need to hammer it to break off pieces and then stew it for a long time to make it soft enough to chew. Alongside the salted protein, your main source of calories comes from grains. Oats are king here, being one of the few cereal crops that could reliably ripen in Scotland's short, cool summers. They form the basis of everything. The porridge, or pottage, that is the staple of every meal, and the flat, unleavened bannocks or oat cakes that are cooked on a hot, flat stone, a girdle, placed directly in the fire's embers. You might also have some barley, used for making a thin, watery stew or, more importantly, for brewing ale. Your vegetable options are grimly limited. In a corner you see a small, sad-looking pile of root vegetables, turnips and parsnips, perhaps some carrots, though they would have been yellow or purple, not orange. These have been stored in a cool, dark corner, but by now they are starting to get soft and woody. They will be chopped up and thrown into the pottage, adding what little variety of flavour and texture is available. Cabbages might have been preserved by pickling them into a sort of primitive sauerkraut. Beyond that, the green world is gone. This lack of fresh produce leads to a host of deficiency diseases. Scurvy, which you might associate with sailors, was a real and present danger for landlocked people in winter. The telltale signs bleeding gums, loose teeth, aching joints, and a profound lethargy would have been a common sight by the late winter months. A quirky tidbit is the search for any possible source of vitamin C. People might chew on pine needles to make a sort of tea, and certain foraged goods from the autumn, like rose hips, might have been dried and used sparingly, prized for their ability to ward off this slow, creeping sickness. The woman stirs the pot, and the smell of the stew, salty meat, oats and turnips, fills the smoky air. There are no exotic spices here. Pepper was an eye-wateringly expensive luxury, available only to the highest nobility. Your seasoning comes from salt, and perhaps some wild garlic or herbs that were gathered and dried in the summer. Historians still argue about the true extent of hunger versus simple nutritional deficiency in a typical winter. Did most reasonably well-off peasant families have enough raw calories to get by, even if the diet was crushingly monotonous and unhealthy? Or was genuine, gnawing hunger the kind that keeps you awake at night, a common experience for all but the richest lords? The evidence from skeletal remains, showing periods of arrested growth in childhood, suggests that seasonal hunger was a recurring trauma for a huge portion of the population. When the stew is finally ready, it's ladled out into the wooden bowls again. There are no individual plates or cutlery sets. You eat with a simple wooden or horn spoon, and you use a piece of oat cake to mop up the juices. Everyone eats from their own bowl, but the feeling is deeply communal, a shared participation in the ritual of survival. The food is not a source of pleasure or culinary exploration. It's fuel. It's the energy needed to face another long, cold, dark night. As you take your first bite, the aggressive saltiness hits the back of your throat. You gratefully wash it down with a swig of the thin, smoky-tasting ale offered to you in a shared drinking horn. It's not great, but it's wet, and likely safer to drink than the water. You eat slowly, consciously, knowing that every spoonful is one less spoonful left in the barrel. The salty stew and smoky ale have left you with a powerful thirst. You look around the Longhouse for a water barrel, some sign of a drink that won't make your head spin. Seeing your searching gaze, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, is given a nod by his mother. He gets up, grabs 2 wooden buckets from near the door and looks at you, jerking his head towards the hide flap. It seems you've just been volunteered for water duty. You pull your still damp cloak around you and follow him, bracing yourself for the shock of the cold as you step back outside. The world you re-enter is utterly transformed. The blizzard has passed, leaving behind a scene of stunning, brutal beauty. The sky is now a vast, inky black, studded with a billion stars that glitter with an icy, unforgiving clarity. There is no moon, but the starlight reflecting off the pristine, newly fallen snow casts a faint, ethereal glow over everything. The wind has died down to a low whisper, but the cold has intensified. The air is perfectly still and so frigid it feels sharp, like tiny needles against your exposed skin. Every breath you take is a physical shock, a sharp pain in your chest. The temperature has plummeted. It's no longer just freezing, it's a deep, hard, geological cold. The boy strides purposefully through the knee-deep snow, his movements practiced and sure. You struggle to follow in his footsteps, the snow cold and powdery, squeaking with every step. A sound that only happens in extreme cold. Your destination is the burn, the stream you followed earlier today. It's not far, maybe 100 yards from the Longhouse, but the short journey feels like a polar expedition. You're heading downhill and the footing is treacherous. The snow hides rocks and uneven ground, and you stumble more than once, earning a faintly scornful glance from your young guide. Access to a reliable source of fresh water was a non-negotiable factor in deciding where to build a settlement, a historical fact that dictated the placement of nearly every village and farmstead in the medieval world. But what is a life-giving convenience in summer becomes a daily, life-threatening challenge in winter. When you reach the bank of the stream, you see the problem. The fast-moving water you saw just hours ago is gone. The burn is now a solid ribbon of white ice, its surface textured with frozen ripples and mounds of snow. The silence is profound, the gurgle and rush of the water completely silenced, frozen in time. The boy sets down his buckets and pulls a small, heavy-headed axe from his belt. He shuffles carefully onto the surface of the ice, his leather-soled shoes offering little grip. and finds a spot where the ice seems thinner. Then he begins to chop. The sound of the axe striking the ice is unnervingly loud in the stillness, a series of sharp, percussive cracks that echo off the opposite side of the glen. It's hard work. He has to strike the same spot over and over, sending shards of ice skittering across the surface. This is a daily ritual. Every drop of water for drinking, for cooking the endless pottage, for giving to the animals inside has to be won from the frozen world with an axe. A quirky tidbit from a slightly later period, but relevant to the mindset, comes from the Icelandic sagas, which are filled with tales of ghosts and draugr haunting the frozen rivers and waterholes. Going for water after dark was considered an act that tempted fate, a journey into a spirit-haunted landscape. The boy here may not have those exact stories, but the feeling of being in a dangerous liminal space is palpable. You stand on the bank, a silent observer, feeling utterly useless. You realise the inherent dangers of this simple task. What if the axe slips? What if the ice, which seems so solid, has a weak spot and you plunge a leg into the lethally cold water beneath? Getting soaked in this temperature, even if you're only a minute from the fire, could be a death sentence. Hypothermia would be swift and merciless. Historians still argue about how communities managed their water sources in deep winter. Did they try to keep a single hole open continuously, or was it easier to chop a new one each day? Was there a communal responsibility for this task, or did each household fend for itself? In a larger settlement, a well might provide an alternative, but even wells could freeze over, requiring someone to be lowered down to break the ice from the surface of the water deep in the earth. For this small firm-toon, the frozen burn is the only option. After several minutes of determined chopping, the boy finally breaks through. Dark, impossibly black water wells up into the hole. He works quickly now, dunking the buckets one by one into the frigid water, the wood groaning in protest at the thermal shock. The filled buckets are immensely heavy. He hands one to you and you nearly drop it, the weight far more than you expected. The simple act of carrying it back up the slight incline to the Longhouse is a gruelling struggle. Water sloshes over the rim, instantly freezing onto your leggings and the side of the bucket. Your hands, already numb, scream in agony as the cold from the wet wood seeps into them. By the time you stumble back inside, gasping for breath, you have a new and profound respect for a simple drink of water. It is not a convenience. It is a hard-won prize, retrieved daily from the jaws of the frozen world. You place the heavy bucket of water on the packed earth floor with a grunt of relief, your hands aching and stiff. The hide flap falls shut behind you, and once again you are sealed inside the Longhouse. The transition is just as jarring as it was the first time. You are back in the world of smoke, shadows, and oppressive closeness. But now you understand that this smoky box is a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of life carved out of the vast frozen emptiness outside. The fire has been fed again, and it crackles merrily, a stark contrast to the profound silence of the snow-covered glen. The family pays you and the boy little mind. The return of water is an expected, routine event. The evening is settling in, and in a medieval Scottish winter, the evening's not a few hours between work and sleep. It is a vast, yawning ocean of darkness that must be navigated. The sun, on the rare occasions it appeared, would have set around 4 in the afternoon. It won't rise again until after 8 in the morning. That's more than 16 hours of absolute total darkness. Your entire perception of time would have to change. You wouldn't think in hours and minutes, but in broader, more elemental phases. The brief period of grey daylight, the long, slow descent into night, the deep blackness of the smut hours, and the agonizingly slow crawl towards dawn. The feeble light from the central hearth and the occasional stinky rushlight does not conquer this darkness. It merely pushes it back a few feet, creating a small, flickering island of visibility in a sea of impenetrable black. The corners of the Longhouse, the sleeping areas, the byre where the animals shift and sigh, all are lost in shadow. This environment heights all your other senses. Your ears especially become incredibly attuned to the subtle symphony of the Longhouse. You hear the rhythmic bubbling of the pot, the soft hiss of melting snow dripping from your cloak near the fire, the whisper of the old man's breath as he dozes, the almost inaudible scratching of a mouse in the thatch. From the far end of the room comes the soft rhythmic grinding of the cattle chewing their cud, a strangely comforting metronomic sound. Every noise has a meaning. A sudden stop in the rhythm of chewing might mean an animal is unwell. A skittering sound in the rafters could be a rat, a dangerous pest that could get into the precious grain stores. A sudden gust of wind pressing against the outer wall sounds like a giant unseen creature leaning against your home. This is a world perceived through sound and smell as much as sight. What do you do for 16 hours in the dark? You can't exactly scroll through your phone or binge watch a series. The options are limited and dictated by the available light. Close to the fire, where visibility is best, tasks that require some light can be done. The women might be mending clothes, their needles flashing in the firelight. A man might be carefully sharpening a knife, carving a new handle for a tool, or weaving a rope from heather stems. This historical fact is that winter, for all its hardships, was a crucial time for manufacturing and repair. It was the season for all the indoor jobs that were neglected during the frantic activity of the planting and harvesting seasons. Your tools, your clothes, your fishing nets, everything had to be ready for the moment the world thawed. For the children, and indeed for everyone, boredom is a real and present enemy. A quirky tidbit from the period is the evidence of simple games found by archaeologists. A board for ninemen's morris might be scratched into a flat stone. Dice, carved from bone or antler, could be used for games of chance. Children might have simple, carved wooden animals to play with. But the primary form of entertainment, the thing that would fill the endless hours, was storytelling. The old man, now awake, might clear his throat and begin a story that everyone has heard 100 times, but listens to with rapt attention. It could be a local legend, a piece of scandalous gossip about a neighbouring family, or a grand epic tale. This was the era of the oral tradition. The great sagas, poems, and histories of the people were not in books. They were held in the collective memory of the community, passed down from one generation to the next around the winter fire. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were a school, a history lesson, and a moral compass, all in one. They taught the children about their ancestors, about the great deeds of heroes, the cunning of tricksters, and the dire consequences of folly and greed. They reinforced the social codes of loyalty, bravery, and hospitality. Historians still argue about the literacy rates in rural medieval Scotland. While the clergy and high nobility could read and write Latin or French, it's almost certain that no one in this longhouse can read a single word. Their library is the old man's memory. His voice, rising and falling in the firelight, weaves a world of magic, monsters, and clan battles that is more real and immediate than the frozen landscape outside. In this suffocating darkness, your imagination is your only escape. You close your eyes and listen, and for a little while the flickering shadows on the wall become the heroes and villains of the tale, and the howling of the wind becomes the cry of a mythical beast. The night is long, but for now the story holds it at bay. As the old man's story winds down, his voice growing raspy, another sound begins to punctuate the quiet rhythm of the longhouse. It's a cough. Not a simple clearing of the throat, but a deep, racking, wet cough coming from a shadowy corner where a pile of hides and bracken serves as a bed. A young woman, who you hadn't paid much attention to before, is curled up in a tight ball, shivering despite being so close to the fire. Her mother goes to her, placing a hand on her forehead and murmuring soothing words. The girl's breathing is shallow and rapid. You're about to witness another of winter's brutal realities, the creeping onslaught of sickness. The conditions inside this longhouse are a perfect storm for the spread of disease. A large group of people are crowded together in a small, poorly ventilated space, sharing the same air, the same utensils, and the same cramped sleeping quarters. Add to this the chronic malnutrition from the monotonous, vitamin-poor diet, and the constant physiological stress of the cold. The result is a population with severely compromised immune systems. This historical fact is that winter was the season of mortality. Parish records from later, better documented periods show a stark spike in deaths during the winter months, not just from accidents or freezing, but from sickness. What might be a common cold for you could easily escalate into a deadly case of pneumonia for someone in this longhouse. Influenza, bronchitis, whooping cough, these respiratory illnesses would sweep through a community with terrifying speed and efficiency. You watch as the mother tries to comfort the sick girl. Her medicine cabinet consists of folk remedies passed down through generations. She might brew a tea from dried yarrow or coltsfoot, herbs gathered in the summer and believed to soothe a cough. She might make a poultice of mashed-up onions and place it on the girl's chest, hoping the pungent fumes will clear her lungs. The smoke-filled air, which you've come to tolerate, is a constant irritant to already inflamed bronchial passages. The old man's chronic winter cough is a testament to a lifetime of this, but for the young and the old, whose bodies are less resilient, it could be a fatal environment. The concept of germ theory is centuries away. Sickness is understood as an imbalance of the body's humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, a theory inherited from the ancient Greeks. Or more likely in this setting, it's seen as the result of malign influences, a curse from an enemy, the ill will of the sìth, the fairies or spirits, or a punishment from God. A quirky and rather grim tidbit of medieval medicine involved using substances we would find utterly repulsive. Remedies could include potions made with wood lice, ointments of fox fat, or plasters made with swallows' nests. A common treatment for a fever might involve bleeding the patient, using a special knife called a lancet to open a vein and drain some of the hot blood that was thought to be causing the illness. It was a dangerous practice that often weakened the patient further, making them even more susceptible to the original disease. Thankfully for now, the mother is sticking to simpler herbal remedies. She dips a cloth in the precious cold water you helped fetch and places it on her daughter's brow. The sickness isn't just physical. The endless darkness, the confinement, the constant cold, and the gnawing anxiety about food supplies took a psychological toll. A condition known as seasonal affective disorder is a modern diagnosis, but the symptoms, lethargy, depression, a sense of hopelessness, would have been a profound reality here. They might not have had a name for it, but they would have known the deep winter melancholy that could settle over a household, making every task seem monumental and every day a struggle. Historians still argue about the role of the official church versus folk belief in the daily lives of the rural poor. While the family is Christian, and a priest might visit occasionally in better weather, their immediate response to sickness is rooted in a much older, pre-Christian worldview. They might whisper a charm or a prayer that mixes Christian saints with older pagan-sounding spirits. The boundary between formal religion and what the church would dismiss as superstition was incredibly blurry. Was the prayer to St. Brigid, or to the older Celtic goddess Brigdi, whose traditions were absorbed into the saint's day? For the woman tending her sick daughter, the distinction is irrelevant. She will try anything that might work. You see the fear in the mother's eyes. There is no doctor to call. There is no hospital. The nearest monastery, which might have an infirmary with monks trained in herbal medicine, could be days of travel away. An impossible journey in this weather. They are completely on their own. The entire family's fate is tied to the strength of the sick girl's constitution and the efficacy of these ancient remedies. Every cough from the corner sends a fresh wave of anxiety through the Longhouse. It's a stark reminder that the greatest threat isn't always the dramatic howling storm outside the walls. Sometimes, the deadliest enemy is the one you can't see, the one that grows in the warmth and darkness right beside the fire. A few days pass, or maybe it's a week. It's hard to tell. Time has lost its sharp edges, smearing into a monotonous cycle of darkness, fire tending, and the quiet tension of waiting. The young woman with the cough is no better, her breathing a constant ragged counterpoint to the life of the Longhouse. You find yourself developing a powerful, almost desperate case of cabin fever. You feel an overwhelming urge to just go outside, to walk, to see a horizon that isn't the smoke-blackened wall 4 feet from your face. One morning, during the brief grey window of daylight, you decide to act on it. Pushing aside the hide flap, you intend to just take a short walk, to breathe air that hasn't been filtered through peat smoke and recycled by 10 people and their cow. You step outside and the plan immediately dies. The world is gone. It has been replaced by an endless, undulating ocean of white. While you are huddled inside, the sky has relentlessly dumped its cargo. The snow is no longer knee-deep, it's waist-deep in places, piled into massive drifts by the wind that are taller than you are. The gentle, rolling landscape you walk through has been completely reshaped, its features smoothed over and erased under a thick, soft blanket of white. The Longhouse itself is half buried, with snow swept up against the turf walls nearly to the low-hanging eaves of the roof. A narrow trench, dug this morning by the men of the house, leads from the door to a small cleared area, but beyond that lies an impassable wilderness. You are snowbound. This is not an inconvenience that cancels school for a day. This is total and absolute isolation, The track you followed to get here has vanished. The frozen burn is buried under 6 feet of snow. Your world has shrunk to the size of this building and the few square yards of cleared space around it. This enforced confinement was a fundamental historical fact of winter life in the Highlands. For weeks, sometimes months on end, a settlement could be completely cut off from the outside world. There would be no travel, no trade, no news. The nearest neighbours, who were a hard day's walk away in autumn, might as well be on the moon. You're on an island in a sea of snow, and you have no idea when the tide will go out. The men of the house are working to clear a path, not for escape, but for survival. They're digging a narrow canyon through the snow towards the peat stack. Their shovels are simple wooden affairs, not the efficient metal tools you know. The work is slow and exhausting. The cold is still intense, and the sunlight reflecting off the snow is blindingly bright. They have to squint, their eyes watering from the glare. Snow blindness, a painful condition caused by the sun burning the corneas, was a real danger. A quirky tidbit is that the Inuit of North America famously invented slit goggles of wood or bone to prevent this, but here the men just have to rely on pulling their hoods low and powering through. Their goal is the fuel pile. Without a path to the peat, the fire dies, and if the fire dies, everyone dies. It is that simple. This imprisonment had profound social and psychological effects. Any simmering tensions within the family are now magnified 100-fold. There is no escape from the person who irritates you, no way to get space after an argument. You are trapped, face to face, for the foreseeable future. The small dramas of the Longhouse become the only dramas in the world, but it also fostered an intense, powerful sense of interdependence. The family unit, and you, are now by necessity a part of it, had to function as a perfect self-sufficient team. Every member had a role, every task was essential. The shared struggle against the overwhelming power of the winter forged bonds of loyalty and reliance that are hard for a modern individualistic society to comprehend. Historians still argue about the extent of this isolation. Were there winter-specific technologies, like rudimentary snowshoes, that allowed for limited travel between settlements? Evidence for snowshoes in Scotland from this period is scant, but not non-existent. It's possible that in some areas people could traverse the snow, perhaps following the high ridges where the wind scoured the ground bare. But for most communities, especially those in the glens and straths, the heavy snowfall meant a complete lockdown. This isolation also had legal and political consequences. The King's Law, administered by sheriffs and judges, effectively ceased to function in the winter. There would be no courts, no tax collection, no official presence. Power devolved to the most local level. The head of the family, the leader of the firm toon, the clan chief. Your little Longhouse has become its own sovereign nation with a population of 12, its foreign policy on hold until the spring thaw. You stand in the narrow snow-walled trench, the light unnaturally bright, the silence absolute. There are no birds, no rustling leaves, not even the whisper of wind. The world is holding its breath under the weight of the snow. You look at the immense, featureless white landscape stretching in every direction, and you feel a new kind of fear. It's not the fear of the cold or the darkness, but the fear of being erased, of being forgotten by a world that has moved on without you. You retreat back into the smoky familiarity of the Longhouse, the hide flap falling shut like the closing of a tomb. The prison of snow and ice is secure. You retreat from the blinding white world back into the familiar gloom of the Longhouse, shaking the powdery snow from your cloak. The air inside feels thick and warm by comparison, but the smells seem more intense today. The usual aromas of smoke, damp earth, and unwashed humanity are now powerfully underscored by a much more animal presence. The far end of the long room, the byre end, is more active than usual. The cattle are restless, shifting their weight and letting out low, mournful moans. The sheep are a nervous, bleating cluster. The prison of snow has not only trapped the humans, but has also cemented their cohabitation with their livestock in the most intimate way possible. You've been vaguely aware of them since you arrived, but now, with the world outside shut down, their presence is impossible to ignore. This is not a quaint pastoral scene. This is a matter of sheer economic necessity. The historical fact is that for this family their animals represented their entire wealth. Their cattle were their bank account, their dowry, their legacy. A single cow was a source of milk in the summer, which could be turned into butter and cheese that might last into the early winter. It provided leather for shoes and harnesses, horn for spoons and cups, and ultimately meat for the pot and hide for the door. The sheep provided the wool for every garment they wore. Losing even one of these animals to the cold or a predator would be a devastating financial blow. So, you bring them inside. The layout of many medieval longhouses explicitly catered to this. The human living area, with its central hearth, flowed directly into the animal quarters at one end, often with only a low partition or a subtle change in floor level to separate them. Sometimes the byre end was slightly lower than the human end. This clever design, known as a cruck frame longhouse, allowed the animal's waste to collect at the far end, making it slightly easier to muck out come spring. More importantly, it allowed the heat from the animals' bodies to rise and help warm the entire shared space. On a night when the fire burns low, the collective body heat of 3 cows and a half-dozen sheep could make the difference between shivering and sleeping. Think of it as a furry, 4-legged radiator system that you also have to feed. Of course, this living arrangement comes with a few downsides. The smell, for one, is pervasive. It's the sweet, grassy scent of their cud, mixed with the sharp, ammonia-like tang of their urine and manure. It seeps into your clothes, your hair, the very thatch of the roof. You just have to get used to it. The noise is another factor. The soft shuffling and chewing can be a comforting background hum, but when an animal is distressed or sick, its cries can fill the small space and keep everyone awake. And then there's the hygiene. The floor at the byre end is a soggy, trampled mess of earth, bracken, and animal waste. This sludge is a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. A quirky and rather stomach-churning tidbit is that insects like flies, which you'd associate with summer, could sometimes continue to thrive in the warm, damp microclimate of the byre end, even in the depths of winter. You watch as the woman of the house throws a meagre forkful of dried fodder to the cattle. Feeding the animals is a major source of winter anxiety. You can't just let them out to graze on the snow-covered hills. Every scrap of hay or dried forage they will eat until spring had to be cut, dried and stored during the summer. A long winter, like this one, could mean the fodder runs out. When that happens, desperate choices have to be made. People would resort to feeding their animals whatever they could find: chopped gorse, dried heather, even the thatch from their own roofs. If that fails, a family might have to make the heartbreaking decision to slaughter a valuable animal they had planned to keep, simply because they can no longer feed it. Historians still argue about the precise emotional relationship between medieval farmers and their animals. Was it purely utilitarian, seeing them as walking assets? Or was there a genuine affection and bond, especially with a valuable milk cow or a trusted plough ox? The evidence suggests it was a complex mixture of both. These animals had names. Their health was a constant topic of conversation and concern. They were individuals. But in the brutal calculus of survival, sentimentality had its limits. You might love your cow, but you love your children more, and if her meat is what will get them through the hungry gap, the decision is grim but clear. The animals also play a role in the unseen spiritual world of the Longhouse. Certain superstitions were attached to them. It might be considered bad luck to stand in a certain position relative to a cow while it was being milked, or a particular sheep might be seen as being fey, or having a connection to the spirit world. For now, they are just your roommates. A sheep lets out a loud, startling "bah!" and you jump. The old man by the fire cracks a smile, the first one you've seen from him. It's a moment of shared absurdity. You, the strange visitor, are just as trapped as they are, huddled together for warmth, sharing your breath and your shelter with a small flock of sheep and a few nervous-looking cows. This is your ark, and you must all ride out the storm together. The initial shock of being snowbound has worn off, replaced by a thick fetching water from the hacked-open hole in the ice, tending the animals, mending tools. But the night's heavy blanket of monotony. The days, or rather the brief grey periods between the long nights, are marked by the same essential: the nights are an eternity. The darkness presses in, and with physical escape impossible, the mind is the only place chores. Fetch water if you can, clear snow, feed the animals, feed the fire. But these tasks, vital left to run. This is when the Longhouse transforms from a shelter into a theatre, a university and a newsroom, all powered by the spoken word. After the meagre evening meal of salty pottage, a sense of expectation as they are, don't fill the vast emptiness of the hours. The real challenge now is not just surviving the cold, but surviving the crushing, mind-numbing boredom. The four walls of the Longhouse are your entire world, and the settles around the hearth. The children, who have been listlessly playing with scraps of wood, wriggle closer to the fire. The men put down their whittling. The women pause their spinning. All eyes turn to the old woman faces within. It are the only ones you see. In this crucible of confinement, you discover the true power of the spoken this time, the matriarch of the family. Her face, a spiderweb of wrinkles in the firelight, holds word. The evening meal is over. The embers of the hearth have been banked to smoulder through the night. The memory of generations. Her voice, when she begins to speak, is thin and reedy, but it commands the attention of the sick girl is sleeping, her breathing still a worrying rasp. The wind has picked up again, a low, mournful howl that entire room. She is the keeper of the stories. Tonight, she doesn't tell a grand epic of heroes and seems to seep through the turf walls. The darkness inside the Longhouse is almost total, broken only by the faint red battles. She tells a local tale, a story about a foolish farmer from the next glen over who was tricked by a glow of the peat embers. It's a perfect stage for stories. The old man, the family's designated kelpie, a mythical water horse that lures travellers to a watery grave. The story's familiar to everyone here, but Keeper of Tales clears his throat. But tonight, it's not just a story. One of the younger men produces They listen as if for the first time. They murmur at the farmer's greed, gasp when the kelpie reveals a small, simple harp, not the grand, gilded instrument of a king's court, but a functional tool for its true, monstrous form, and nod in satisfaction when the hero of the story, a clever girl from their own family making music. He plucks a few notes, the sound clear and haunting in the smoky air. What follows is a mix line, of course, outwits the beast. These stories are not just for entertainment. This historical fact is that of entertainment and ritual. He might sing a ballad about a local hero. A song of a tragic love affair between a folklore was a critical tool for teaching practical survival lessons. The story about the kelpie isn't just a spooky tale. It's a stark warning. Don't go near the treacherous deep pools in the river. The story about the fairy laird's daughter and a humble fisherman. The tunes are simple, the melodies ancient and modal, full of melancholy. Who steals unattended babies is a way to ensure mothers never leave their infants alone. Folklore encoded generations of wisdom about the dangers of the landscape and longing. The lyrics tell you about the values of this culture, the importance of loyalty, the folly of pride, the endeavour into memorable, easily transmitted narratives. When her story ends, the mood shifts. The old man who told the battle, ability of fate. This is how history was taught and remembered. The historical fact is that in a largely illiterate society, Music Saga a few nights ago now leans forward and shares a piece of news he heard back in the autumn, before the snow and poetry were the primary vehicles for transmitting information. A catchy tune and a rhyming structure made complex genealogies. Historicals came. It's about a dispute between two powerful lords a few glens away. He recounts the supposed insults, the alliances' events, and legal precedents much easier to memorise. The great Cailleach epics, like the tales of Fionn Mac, the potential for a raid come spring. This is their equivalent of the evening news. It's a mix of Fat Cumhail and his warrior band, the Fianna, were preserved for centuries in this way, passed from one bard to the next, rumour and outright speculation, but it's vital information. Understanding the shifting power dynamics of the region could be long before they were ever written down. After a song or two, the storytelling begins. The old man might recount a part of the Tín Buachailge, the cattle raid of Cooley, an epic crucial for survival. Who you can trust, who you must fear. This intelligence is worth more than gold. Then tale of war and heroes from the Irish Ulster cycle, which was well known and loved in Scotland. The children, one of the younger men, who has a good voice, is coaxed into singing a song. It's a long who have heard it all before, listen with wide eyes, mouthing the words. The story is interactive. People shout encouragement to sad ballad about a lover lost at sea. His voice fills the smoky room, pure and clear. There is no musical the hero hiss at the villain. It's a communal experience, a way of reaffirming who they are and wear accompaniment, just the percussive crackle of the fire and the soft sighs of the cattle. Music was woven into the fabric they come from. It's their version of a blockbuster movie, except the special effects are all in their heads, painted of daily life. There were work songs for rowing or for walking cloth, the laborious process of beating newly woven wool by the storyteller's words against the canvas of the firelit darkness. Then the mood might shift, to soften and shrink it. There were lullabies, drinking songs, and these beautiful, mournful ballads that seemed to capture the soul stories could turn to the supernatural, to the things that lurk in the winter darkness just outside the walls. They might tell tales of the land and its people. A quirky tidbit is the concept of the bard. In a high-status household, like the Bean Nii, the washerwoman at the ford, a grim fairy who is seen washing the bloody clothes of those that of a clan chief, the bard was a highly respected professional poet and musician, trained for years to memorise and recite the clan's entire history, genealogy, and greatest triumphs. In this humble longhouse, you are seeing the grassroots version of that, about to die. To see her as a death omen, or they might share gossip. A quirky tidbit of social ordinary people using song and story to preserve their own, more personal histories. Historians still argue about the true life was the winter Cailleach, pronounced Cailleach, an informal gathering in a house for music, stories and news. Since you're snowbound, your Cailleach is an internal affair, but the function is the same, age and origin of many of these famous Gaelic and Scots ballads. Were they ancient echoes of a pagan past, or were they largely composed in the medieval period, reflecting the specific concerns of a feudal Christian society? The truth is likely a blend. The woman of the house might share a piece of news she heard back in the autumn about a dispute over land in the next glen, and everyone will weigh in with their opinion. Who was in the right? What will the chief do about it come? You can hear it in the stories. A creature from pre-Christian myth might be defeated by a character who makes the sign of the cross. The old beliefs were not erased. They were woven into the new, creating a rich and complex tapestry of belief spring. This is how public opinion was formed and social norms were enforced. Your reputation was everything, and it was forged and debated in these firelit sessions. Historians still argue about the role of the professional storyteller or Ozé. The fire is burning lower now, the shadows growing deeper. The shared experience has a powerful effect. It binds a Chade in this period. In the courts of the great lords and clan chiefs, these were highly respected figures, repositories Yule together. Listening to the stories, you're no longer just a stranger. You share the same fears, laugh at the same jokes, and feel a swell of pride at the triumphs of the family's ancestors. The isolation of the clan's history and genealogy. But how far did this tradition filter down to the level of a humble Firmtoon snowstorm has, paradoxically, created a moment of intense community? It's a defence mechanism against the psychological pressure like this one. Was your host, the old man, just a good amateur with a fine memory, or was he part of the confinement and the darkness? Boredom, fear and despair are held at bay by the shared act of creation, more formal system of oral tradition. The line was likely blurred. In a world with no other media, anyone with a good memory. The Longhouse is filled not just with smoke, but with the collective imagination of its inhabitants. For a few hours, the inner flair for the dramatic was a precious resource. The harp music, the epic tales, the ghost stories, grim reality of the endless winter is forgotten, replaced by a world of magic, music and memory. You pull your itchy the gossip. It's all part of a complex strategy for mental survival. It pushes back the fear of the dark, wool cloak tighter, feeling a strange sense of belonging, a temporary citizen in this kingdom of the night. Word the sickness and the dwindling food pile. It binds the family together, reminding them of their shared history and their shared fate. It turns the long dead hours of the night into a time of connection and creativity. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the need to create meaning and beauty even in the most hostile of environments. You lean back against the rough wall, the hard edges of your fear softened by the melody of the harp. The Longhouse is no longer just a prison of snow, it's a theatre, a library and a concert hall. The stories of epic battles and heroic clan chiefs might seem like a distant romantic memory in the dead of winter, but the reality of conflict is never far away. While the snow has put a stop to large-scale warfare, no sane lord would try to move an army through waist-deep drifts and frozen passes. It doesn't end the violence. Instead, it changes its nature. Winter is the season of the desperate small-scale raid, an act of violence born not of politics or honour but of pure, gnawing hunger. One night you're jolted from a shallow, shivering sleep not by a cough or a mooing cow, but by a different sound. It's the frantic, aggressive barking of the scrawny dog that usually sleeps by the fire. The men of the house are instantly awake, their movements silent and swift in the darkness. One of them puts a hand on the dog's muzzle to quiet it, while the other two grab weapons that have been leaning against the wall, ready for this exact moment. A long-hafted axe, a simple fire-hardened spear. They are not preparing for a battle. They are preparing to repel boarders. Someone is outside. The historical fact is that winter stripped away the thin veneer of social order. When a family's own food stores began to run out, the sight of a neighbour's healthy-looking cattle, or a wisp of smoke from a chimney promising a full peat stack, became an unbearable temptation. The old Scottish word for this kind of raid is reiving, a term more famously associated with the border reivers along the English-Scottish frontier, but the practice was widespread throughout the Highlands. It was a brutal, opportunistic form of warfare. A small band of men, their faces wrapped in wool against the biting cold, would travel under the cover of a stormy night, using the blizzard to mask their approach. Their goal was simple: get in, grab whatever they could, livestock, food, anything of value, and get out before a proper defence could be mounted. You hold your breath in the tense silence. The men don't light a rushlight. They are using the darkness as their ally, their eyes already accustomed to the gloom. You can hear faint, muffled sounds from outside now, the crunch of snow, a whispered command. The hide flap over the door is the weak point, and one of the men stands beside it, axe held ready. The fear in the Longhouse is thick enough to taste. The women have gathered the children into the tightest corner, trying to stifle their frightened whimpers. This is not a fight for land or glory. This is a fight for the food that stands between your hosts and starvation in the coming months. The cattle in the byre, sensing the tension, begin to shift and low nervously. Their presence is both the prize for the attackers and the reason for the desperate defence. A quirky, yet deadly aspect of this winter warfare was the use of the environment itself as a weapon. Raiders might try to set fire to the thatched roof of a longhouse, a terrifyingly effective tactic. The family inside would be faced with an impossible choice: stay inside and choke or burn, or run out into the snow and be cut down by the waiting attackers. In this case, the deep snow and damp thatch might make that difficult, but the threat is always there. Another tactic was to simply drive off the livestock, leaving the family alive but destitute. A slow death sentence rather than a quick one. The tension snaps. There's a sudden, violent tearing sound as a knife slashes through the hide door. An arm reaches through, fumbling for the wooden bar that secures it from the inside. Before the intruder can find it, the man with the axe brings it down with a sickening wet crunch. A scream from outside is abruptly cut off. The arm disappears. There is a flurry of shouted curses from the attackers, and then the sound of receding footsteps in the snow. It's over as quickly as it began. They were a small, probing party, and the swift, brutal response has convinced them that the prize isn't worth the risk. They have retreated for now, leaving one of their own wounded or dead in the snow. The man retrieves the axe. There is no triumph, no celebration, just grim, shaky relief. The wooden bar is checked, reinforced with a heavy chest pushed against the door. The women soothe the crying children. The night's peace is shattered, and a new, more immediate fear now hangs in the air. The raiders know they are here. They might come back, and they might come back in greater numbers. Historians still argue about how much of this inter-clan raiding was driven by ancient deep-seated feuds, and how much was simple, brutal economics. Was the attack you just witnessed part of a generations-old conflict, or was it just a random act of desperation by a neighbouring firm-toon whose own peat stack was low and whose salted meat barrel was empty? In the dead of winter the motives blur. Honour and hunger become indistinguishable. The family will not sleep again tonight. They will sit by the fire, weapons in hand, listening to the wind, wondering if every gust is the sound of returning footsteps. The raid has brought the harsh reality of the outside world crashing into their isolated sanctuary. The prison of snow, which you had seen as a force of isolation, is also a shield, and tonight that shield was almost breached. You realise that the stories of battles and warriors are not just nostalgia. They are a living tradition, a necessary mindset for a world where your neighbour might try to kill you for the price of a cow. The fear from the attempted raid lingers in the Longhouse for days. An extra watch is kept through the night, and every creak of the roof or howl of the wind causes people to start. The violence of man has been added to the violence of nature, and the sanctuary feels less secure. In this heightened state of anxiety, the conversation around the fire turns from practical fears to supernatural ones. The world outside the turf walls is not just seen as empty and cold, it's perceived as being inhabited by powerful, ancient and often malevolent forces that awaken in the winter, and one name is spoken more than any other, in hushed and respectful tones: the Cailleach. You listen as the old woman tells the story. The Cailleach is not a simple witch or a minor spook. She is the divine hag of winter, a creator goddess, and a destroyer in one. In some tales, she is a giantess who strode across the land, accidentally creating mountains and lochs as she dropped rocks from her apron. This is the historical fact of her lore. The Cailleach is a personification of the winter itself. She is ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the struggles of humanity. She carries a great staff or hammer, and wherever she strikes the ground, it freezes solid. Her breath is the biting winter wind, and the plaid she wears is the blanket of white snow that covers the land. According to the stories, she rules the dark half of the year, from Samhain at the beginning of November to Bedtime at the beginning of May. The length and severity of the winter depend entirely on her mood. If she wishes for a long winter, she'll make sure the weather is bright and sunny on the 1st of February, the festival of Imbolc, later Christianised as St. Bridget's Day, so she can go out and gather more firewood for herself. A foul day on Imbolc is a good sign, as it means the Cailleach is asleep, and her store of firewood, and thus the remaining winter, is running low. This folklore provided a framework for understanding and predicting the weather, a mythology built around the terrifying whims of the climate. As you listen, you realise that the landscape you saw as merely harsh and beautiful is, to this family, enchanted and alive. Every landmark has a story, and many are tied to the Cailleach. A strangely shaped mountain might be her petrified form. A collection of standing stones could be her attendants, turned to stone when the sun touched them. A fierce whirlpool in a coastal strait is the Cailleach washing her great plaid, a process that heralds the coming of winter's storms. This belief system turned a dangerous and unpredictable environment into a narrative, making it something that could be understood, if not controlled. A quirky and specific tidbit of this folklore is the Cailleach of the last sheaf. At the end of the harvest, the very last sheaf of grain to be cut was often woven into the shape of a woman, a corn dolly. This was the Cailleach. It would be taken back to the farmer's house and kept in a place of honour. It was seen as a vessel for the spirit of the grain, ensuring its life would return in the spring. However, it was also considered bad luck to be the last farmer in the district to finish your harvest, as you would be stuck looking after the old woman all winter, which was seen as a poor omen for your household's health and prosperity. The talk around the fire isn't limited to the great hag of winter. The long dark nights are filled with whispers of other beings. They speak of the sìth, pronounced she, the fairy folk who are not the tiny winged creatures of Victorian fancy. These are the descendants of the ancient pre-Christian gods of the land, a powerful and proud race who live in hollow hills and underground palaces. They are beautiful but dangerous, known for stealing children, leading travellers astray, and curdling the milk of cows. An offering of milk might be left on a doorstep to appease them, the man who was wounded in the raid. Some might whisper that his wound will be slow to heal because the raider's knife was enchanted by the sìth. Historians still argue about how literally the medieval Scot believed in these entities. Was the Cailleach a genuine deity to be worshipped, or a powerful metaphor for the forces of nature? Were the sìth real beings to be feared, or just bogeymen used to scare children into behaving? The line between belief and metaphor was likely very thin, perhaps non-existent. In a world without scientific explanations for the changing seasons, for sudden illnesses, or for the strange noises in the night, this supernatural framework provided a kind of order. Attributing a failed harvest to the Cailleach's wrath, or a sick cow to a fairy's curse, gave a name and a face to misfortune, which was perhaps less terrifying than the idea that suffering could be random and meaningless. You look around the firelit room, the faces are grim, but there is a strange comfort in their talk. By naming these fears, by sharing the ancient stories, they are asserting a kind of control over them. They are, the the weeks have crawled by in a blur of grey days and black nights, a monotonous routine of survival punctuated by moments of sharp fear. The mood in the Longhouse has grown heavy and oppressive. The salted meat is tasting saltier, the oat porridge blander, and the darkness deeper. A profound weariness has settled over everyone, a bone-deep exhaustion from the constant grinding struggle against the cold and hunger. But then, one evening, a subtle shift occurs. The man of the house brings in a large log, a particularly fine, dry piece of birch he had saved, and places it carefully beside the hearth. A rare, almost smile plays on his lips. It is a signal. The longest night is approaching, and with it, a promise of reprieve. You are about to experience Yule, the ancient celebration of the winter solstice. In a world governed by the sun, the solstice was a moment of immense astronomical and psychological importance. It was the day the sun stood still, the pivot point of the year when the long, slow retreat into darkness would finally end, and the promise of light's return was made real. For a people trapped in the suffocating grip of winter, this was the most important festival of the year, a desperately needed explosion of light, warmth, and feasting in the very heart of the gloom. The historical fact is that the celebration of Yule predates Christianity by centuries. While the Church later co-opted the date for Christmas, many of the traditions you are about to witness are deeply rooted in pagan Norse and Celtic practices. The very word Yule comes from the Old Norse star Jol. The preparations begin subtly. The woman of the house retrieves a small cloth-wrapped bundle from a secure spot in the rafters. Inside is a small hoard of precious ingredients, saved for this exact moment. A handful of dried berries, a lump of honey, and most prized of all, a small cache of wheat flour, a luxury compared to the common oats. She will use this to bake special cakes, a rare treat that will taste impossibly sweet and rich after weeks of monotonous pottage. On the day of the solstice, the atmosphere in the Longhouse is transformed. The air, usually thick with tension and boredom, now crackles with a festive energy. The men clear the byre end with extra care. The floor is swept and fresh bracken is laid down. The children, who have been sullen and listless, are now wide-eyed with excitement. The centrepiece of the celebration is the Yule log. It's not just any piece of firewood, it is symbolic. It represents the warmth and light of the sun, and keeping it burning through the longest night is a vital ritual. The head of the household might sprinkle it with a little ale or dust it with flour as an offering before it's ceremonially placed on the hearth. As it catches fire, its bright crackling flames seem to push back the darkness more effectively than the usual smouldering peat. Then comes the feast. This is not the usual, grimly functional meal. Tonight the family will eat a portion of the meat they had planned to save for the hungry gap later in the winter. A piece of pork, perhaps, from a pig slaughtered in the autumn, is roasted over the fire, its fat sputtering and filling the air with a smell so delicious, it's almost painful. The special wheat cakes are served, and most importantly, there is ale. Not the thin, watery stuff of daily drinking, but a special Yule brew, made with more barley and perhaps some herbs for flavour. It is dark, strong, and potent. The drinking horn is passed around freely, and for the first time in a long time, you hear genuine, unrestrained laughter in the Longhouse. A quirky tidbit of the Yule celebration involved evergreens. Sprigs of holly, ivy or fir might be brought inside to decorate the bleak interior. In a world that had become brown and white, these defiant splashes of green were a powerful symbol of everlasting life, a reminder that nature was not dead, only sleeping. It was a tangible connection to the promise of spring. These greens were often believed to have protective properties, warding off evil spirits who were thought to be particularly powerful during the dark days of midwinter. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the religious observance during this transitional period. The family would likely attend a Christmas Mass if a priest were available, embracing the story of Christ's birth. But their private celebrations in the home would be a syncretic blend of old and new beliefs. They might say a prayer to the Christian God for seeing them through the darkness, and in the next breath raise a toast to the old gods or the spirits of the land, thanking them for the turning of the season. For them, there was no contradiction. It was all part of the same spiritual effort to ensure survival and encourage the return of the sun. As the strong ale takes effect, the mood becomes boisterous. Songs are sung, louder and more cheerful than the mournful ballads of previous nights. Stories are told, but they are tales of triumph and comedy, not grim warnings. For this one night, The gnawing anxiety about the future is deliberately set aside. They feast and drink with a kind of desperate joy, a conscious act of defiance against the winter. It is a huge gamble, consuming precious resources that they may desperately need in the cold weeks to come, but it's a necessary one. This brief bright festival is a psychological lifeline. It refuels their depleted reserves of hope, reminding them that the darkness is not eternal. You sit by the blazing Yule log, the warmth soaking into you, a belly full of rich food and strong ale, and for the first time you feel a flicker of genuine hope that you might, just might, make it to spring. Reminding themselves of the old rules, the ways to placate the unseen powers that govern their world, you, with your modern, rational mind, might dismiss it all as superstition. But as you listen to the wind moaning outside like a giantess in mourning, and you think of the silent, waiting whiteness of the snow, you can't help but feel a sliver of the same primal fear. The world outside the Longhouse door feels immense and ancient, and the idea that it is ruled by a cold, cruel, and powerful old woman seems, in the dead of a Scottish winter night, entirely plausible. The cheerful embers of the Yule log have long since faded, and the memory of the feast is now just a pleasant ghostly warmth in your belly. The deep winter grinds on, but the brief respite has left a subtle change in the atmosphere. The solstice has passed. The days are, imperceptibly at first, the cheerful embers of the Yule log have long since faded, and the memory beginning to lengthen. The light may only last a few minutes longer each afternoon, but it's a victory. Of the feast is a pleasant, but distant dream. The deep winter has returned with a vengeance, the snow piling. However, this return of the light does not bring a return of order. In fact, in many ways the opposite even higher, the cold somehow feeling more personal and vindictive. The brief, festive truce is over, and it is in this profound is true. The isolation which you've experienced as a social and physical reality has a profound legal consequence. Isolation in the heart of the frozen months that another pillar of society silently crumbles. The law. For all intents and purposes, the law of the land is frozen solid. The historical fact is that the authority of the Scottish Crown attempted raid a few weeks ago left a lingering tension, a raw nerve in the small community of the Longhouse. One afternoon and its judiciary was heavily dependent on the ability to travel. The King's justice was administered by itinerant officials, sheriffs. Just as the men are clearing snow, a heated argument breaks out between the father of the family and his eldest son. It starts skiers, coroners, who move from one burg or shire to the next, holding courts, settling disputes, and punishing criminals. But in winter, this entire system seized up. The roads are impassable, the ferries across the firths not running over something trivial, the proper way to stack the cleared snow, but quickly escalates. Old grievances, resentments that, and the mountain passes are buried in snow. The sheriff is safely ensconced in his stone tower in a distant town, and have been simmering for weeks in the close confinement, boil to the surface. Accusations are thrown, voices are he is not coming here until the spring thaw. This legal vacuum has direct and dangerous consequences for the family you're with, remember raised. In a normal season, such a dispute might be taken to a higher authority to be mediated, but now there is no higher authority. This is the historical fact of winter governance, the King's law, and even the Lord the Raiders who attacked a few weeks ago. In a normal season, the head of the family could have, in theory, sought justice. He could have travelled to the sheriff's court and formally accused the rival family of assault and attempted's law, effectively froze along with the rivers. The infrastructure of justice simply ceased to function. The King's sheriff, theft. Witnesses would be called, oaths would be sworn, and a judgment, however flawed or biased, would be made the circuit judges known as justiciars, and other royal officials could not travel. The roads, if you can. But now there is no higher authority to appeal to. Justice becomes an entirely local and personal affair. The only call them that were impassable. Manorial courts, where a local lord would dispense justice for his tenants, where law that exists is the law of the clan and the lex talionis, an eye for an eye, you witness often suspended. This meant that for several months of the year, justice became an intensely local and often arbitrary affair. There was a conversation one evening between the man of the house and his brother. Their words are low and grim. They are debating no one to appeal to, No one to enforce a contract, and most critically, no one to punish a crime in what to do about the raid. They think they know which family was responsible, a settlement in a neighbouring glen with a reputation, the Longhouse. The father, as the head of the household, is the ultimate authority. His word is law. He resolves the argument with his son through a stern command, and the son, sullen but obedient, acquiesces. But what if the dispute for trouble? Their talk is not of courts or evidence, but of retribution. Should they gather their kin and mount a counter was more serious? What if it was between two separate families in the same isolated firm tune, without an external raid? When would be the best time? A moonless night, with a fresh fall of snow to cover their tracks, is a stark reminder that the simmering clan feuds that characterise so much of Scottish history didn't just pause for mediator. A simple argument over a stray sheep or a perceived insult could fester and escalate into a violent, multi-generational blood the winter. The cold months were a time for grudges to fester, for plans to be made, and for scores feud. The history of the Scottish clans is rife with such stories. Feuds that began with a minor incident and to be settled outside the frozen reach of official law. A quirky and illustrative aspect of medieval Scottish law was the concept of, with no legal system to intervene, spiralled into decades of reciprocal murder and vengeance. Winter was the perfect incubator for such letters of fire and sword. This was a royal commission granted to a powerful lord or clan chief, giving them the legal authority hatreds. You see the practical implications of this legal vacuum. The fear of another raid is constant. If the raiders had to pursue a rival clan with, quite literally, fire and sword, it was essentially a license to conduct a private war. Succeeded, stolen the cattle and killed one of the family, what recourse would the survivors have? They couldn't send, while such letters wouldn't be issued or acted upon in the depths of winter. The underlying principle, that powerful local a messenger to the sheriff at the local castle town. They couldn't expect a posse to be dispatched to track down the culprits. Their only recourse would be to wait for the thaw and then seek their own justice, a revenge raid. Figures were often the real enforcers of justice, was magnified tenfold when the official system was on hiatus. The local laird or clan chief became the sole judge, jury and executioner. This breakdown of formal law affects more than just violent. This system, or lack thereof, created a perpetual cycle of violence, a quirky and rather grim legal concept from this era crime. What about a dispute over property? Imagine if one of the cows from your Longhouse wandered off during a brief in parts of Scotland was the Letter of Fire and Sword, a commission granted by the Crown to a powerful lord or clan chief Thaw, and was found and claimed by a neighbour. How do you prove ownership? Without a court to hear the case, giving him the legal authority to pursue a rival clan with, as the name suggests, fire and sword, it could devolve into a shouting match, a brawl, or a simmering blood feud that could last for generations. What a license to carry out a private war. But to get such a letter, you had to be able to reach the about debts. If a man owes you barley and refuses to pay, you have no legal recourse until the sheriff can travel authorities. In winter, you were on your own. This breakdown of formal law enforcement placed an enormous emphasis on reputation again in April or May. Historians still argue about how much of the day-to-day justice in medieval Scotland was and communal pressure. In a community where you are trapped with the same dozen people for months, your good name is your most valuable asset. A person known to be untrustworthy, lazy or violent would be ostracised. This ever handled by the formal royal courts, versus how much was always dealt with through informal local customary law. In places like the Highlands, it's likely that the clan-based system, with its own intricate rules of compensation and retribution, informal social control was a powerful force, but it had its limits. It could manage internal squabbles but was useless against external threats. Historians still argue about how completely the formal legal system shut down. In the more populous and accessible was always the more relevant authority. The winter simply made this de facto reality an absolute one. The family you Lowlands, it's possible that some local courts could continue to function intermittently, but in the remote glens and islands are withers for now choosing a path of caution. They don't have the numbers to guarantee success in a counter of the Highlands. The isolation was near total. Here, the law was a combination of ancient custom, clan tradition raid, and a failure would be catastrophic. So they wait, but the injustice gnaws at them, the insult and the immediate will of the local strongman. Was a chief's judgment based on a recognised code of conduct to their honour? The threat to their existence? It's a poison that seeps into the long dark hours, or simply his own whim? It was likely a mixture. The law of the clan was a real concept. The law has abandoned them to the snows. They are self-governing, and that means they are also self-deaf, but its application could be inconsistent and brutal. You realise that the weapons the men keep close at hand are not just ending. The axe that repelled the first attack is kept sharpened, not just for chopping wood, but for a purpose for fending off raiders. They are a constant symbol of this legal reality. In a world where there is no police far grimmer, the peace of the Longhouse is a fragile thing, maintained not by a distant king's decree. Forced to call, your own strength and the willingness to use it are your only true protection. The concept of personal security, but by the strength of the men's arms and their willingness to use the weapons that lean, waiting against the cold turf is entirely your own responsibility. The family must act as its own police, its own jury, and if necessary, its wall. The absence of law is a heavy, dangerous presence in the room. Amidst the adult world of simmering feuds, gnawing hunger, and back-breaking chores, it's easy to overlook the other inhabitants of the Longhouse, the children. You see a small cluster of them, their ages ranging from a toddler swaddled in wool to a boy on the cusp of adolescence. For them, this long dark winter is not an anomaly. It is the fabric of life itself. Their world is one of strange contrasts, a mixture of crushing boredom, sudden terror, and moments of simple, unadulterated play, all confined within the smoky 20-foot length of this room. Their existence is not the carefree, protected childhood you might imagine. From a very young age, every child was expected to contribute to the household's survival. The historical fact is that childhood in the modern sense, a distinct period of life dedicated to education and play, did not exist for the vast majority of the medieval population. Children were seen as miniature adults, and they were integrated into the world of work as soon as they were physically able. A girl of 6 or 7 would already be learning to spin wool with a drop spindle, a crucial skill for the family's textile production. She would be responsible for watching her younger siblings, for stirring the pottage, for feeding the hens if the family was lucky enough to have any. A boy of the same age would be tasked with collecting kindling, helping to muck out the byre, or learning to mend a leather strap. Their play was often a form of practice for their future roles. You watch 2 of the younger children playing by the fire. Their toys are not plastic or electronic, they are objects from the world around them. One is floating a piece of bark in the bucket of water you helped fetch, a makeshift boat on a tiny frigid sea. Another is carefully arranging small smooth stones into patterns on the packed earth floor. They might have a ball made from a pig's bladder, stuffed with straw and stitched up, or perhaps a simple, carved wooden animal worn smooth with years of handling. A quirky tidbit of archaeology is the discovery of miniature, domestic items at medieval sites, tiny pots, small knives, little loom weights, which suggests that children's play often mimicked the adult work they saw around them, a form of apprenticeship that began in the cradle. But winter also brought a unique set of challenges and dangers for them. The Longhouse, with its open hearth, was a hazardous environment. A moment of carelessness could lead to a terrible burn. The constant damp and cold made them particularly vulnerable to the sicknesses that festered in the close quarters. The girl with the persistent cough is a constant, worrying reminder of this fragility. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was a harsh reality that many families would lose 1 or more children to sickness or accident before they reached adulthood. This wasn't due to a lack of love, but a lack of modern medicine, sanitation, and an understanding of nutrition. Despite the hardships, the winter confinement was not without its small joys. The storytelling sessions were their primary form of education and entertainment, filling their minds with heroes, monsters, and a sense of their place in the world. A heavy snowfall, which for the adults was a curse of isolation, could be a source of wonder for a child, a chance to play in the cleared patch by the door under the watchful eye of a parent. A simple game of hide and seek among the peat stacks could while away a precious hour of daylight. Historians still argue about the emotional landscape of medieval childhood. Some earlier historians proposed that the high mortality rates led parents to be emotionally distant from their young children, investing less love in a child who might not survive. However, most modern scholars reject this, pointing to evidence from letters, poems, and legal documents that show deep and abiding parental love and profound grief at the loss of a child. The constant fear of loss likely made the emotional bonds even more intense. You see it in the way the mother instinctively pulls her smallest child closer when a gust of wind rattles the hide door, a small, fierce gesture of protection against a world full of dangers. The world of the children is also a world of sensory memory. The smell of peat smoke, the scratch of a wool blanket, the taste of salty porridge, the feel of the cold draft on the floor, the sound of their grandfather's voice telling a story in the dark. These would be the building blocks of their consciousness. They have no concept of a centrally heated house, a soft bed, or a diet of anything other than what this land can provide. This is simply the way the world is. The winter is not a season to be endured so they can get back to normal life. The winter is normal life for almost half of every year of their existence. It forges them, making them resilient, resourceful, and acutely aware of the precariousness of their own survival. You watch the young boy, the one who led you to the frozen stream, as he carefully sharpens a small piece of wood with a knife under his father's supervision. He's not just playing, he is learning. He's preparing to take his place in the endless cyclical battle against the brutal Scottish winter. The Longhouse, for all its oppressive closeness, feels like a fortress compared to the existence you might be leading if your journey had taken you just a few miles in a different direction. While your hosts in this inland glen battle the monotony of the snow-locked landscape, a different kind of winter struggle is playing out along Scotland's rugged coastline. Imagine, for a moment, that the flicker of light you followed was not from a firm tune nestled in a valley, but from a fishing village huddled in a rocky cove facing the open, unforgiving sea. Here, the enemy is not the silent, smothering blanket of snow, but the raw, kinetic violence of the North Atlantic. The wind does not just moan, it shrieks, a physical force that drives colossal waves to smash against the cliffs, sending plumes of icy spray hundreds of feet into the air. The sound is a constant, thunderous roar that vibrates through the ground, a perpetual reminder of the sea's terrifying power. The houses here are built even lower to the ground, their turf or stone walls thick, their roofs weighted down with ropes and heavy stones to keep the thatch from being ripped away by the gales. There is no peace here, only a relentless, noisy assault. The historical fact of life for these coastal communities was a paradoxical relationship with the sea. In winter, the sea was a monster. It was the bringer of storms that could swallow fishing boats whole, that could erode the very land the village stood on. Travel by sea, the main highway for trade and communication in the summer, became almost impossible. The same storms that isolated the inland glens with snow also trapped the coastal villages behind a wall of furious water. But at the same time, the sea was their only hope. The land around these villages was often thin and poor, incapable of producing enough food to sustain the population. The fields are barren and frozen, just like in the glen. The true harvest here came from the water. Even in the heart of winter, on days when the storms abate for a precious nerve-wracking few hours, the men would have to go out. You would watch them, a small group of figures silhouetted against a grey churning sea, as they manhandle their boat down the shingle beach. The boat is not a large vessel. It's a small, open cobble, or skiff, propelled by oars and perhaps a single, simple square sail. It seems terrifyingly fragile against the backdrop of the massive steel-grey swells. The decision to launch is a gamble of the highest stakes. A misjudged wave, a sudden shift in the wind, and the boat could be swamped or smashed, and the crew, husbands, fathers, sons, lost forever. Their target is whatever they can catch. Primarily they would be seeking whitefish like cod and ling from the inshore waters. The fish would be caught on long lines with hundreds of hooks baited with shellfish or salted scraps. A quirky tidbit of this life is the immense labour that went into preparing the lines. The women and children would spend hours on the shore digging for bait in the freezing sand, then carefully baiting each individual hook. It was a communal effort. The entire village invested in the success and survival of the men at sea. If they returned, their catch would be a lifeline, providing fresh protein to supplement the grim diet of salted herring and oats. Anything extra could be salted or dried for the future. The coast also offered other, more marginal resources. At low tide, people would venture out onto the slippery, treacherous rocks to gather shellfish like mussels and limpets, or to harvest edible seaweed like dulse and carrageen. These were starvation foods, perhaps, but they were food nonetheless. providing vital minerals and a change from the monotonous diet. Historians still argue about the importance of seabirds in the medieval coastal diet. While evidence suggests that fowling, catching birds like gannets, puffins and guillemots from the sheer cliff faces, was a major activity in some parts of Scotland like the islands of St Kilda, it's unclear how widespread it was as a winter food source. It was an incredibly dangerous activity, requiring men to be lowered down cliffs on flimsy ropes, but the payoff in meat, eggs and feathers could be substantial. For those on the coast, the fear of starvation was matched by the fear of shipwreck. A winter storm could drive a trading vessel from Norway or the Low Countries onto the rocks. For the wreck's crew, it was a catastrophe. For the local villagers, it was a grim opportunity. While the church condemned the practice, wrecking, looting the cargo of a wrecked ship, was a common survival strategy. A barrel of wine, a bolt of cloth, a chest of iron tools washing ashore would be a gift from a god, or the sea itself. It was a brutal calculus, but in a world of profound scarcity, the line between salvage and theft was easily blurred by the roar of the surf. So while your longhouse in the glen is a sanctuary of quiet, if tense, isolation, a coastal village would be a place of constant nerve-shredding anxiety. The men's lives depend on their skill and luck every time they launch their boat. The women's lives depend on waiting, staring out at the grey horizon, praying for their return. The cold is damper, the wind is louder, and the stakes, in some ways, feel even higher. The snow isolates, but the sea threatens to devour. It is the same winter, but a different battle, fought on a different front. Your experience has been shaped by the rhythms of this small, isolated, firm tune, a place that feels ancient and governed by rules that predate any king. But as you listen to the stories and the gossip, you begin to understand that your longhouse exists within a much larger and deeply divided Scotland. The hardships of winter, while universal, were not uniform. The struggle for survival in the Gaelic-speaking, clan-based Highlands where you are now was culturally and economically different from the struggle in the Scots-speaking, more feudal lowlands to the south and east. The landscape itself dictated much of this difference. The Highlands, the vast and mountainous northern two-thirds of the country, was a region of high peaks, deep glens and poor acidic soil. It was not suited to large-scale agriculture. This historical fact shaped its entire society. Life was pastoral, revolving around cattle, which were grazed on high summer pastures and brought down to the glens for the winter. Power was fragmented and personal, based on kinship and loyalty to a clan chief. The longhouse you're in, with its small cluster of related families, is the fundamental building block of this society. Their wealth is on the hoof, in the byre at the end of the room. Their winter survival depends on their own stored food, the health of their animals, and their ability to defend themselves. Now imagine the winter experience of a peasant farmer in the lowlands, perhaps in the fertile plains of Lothian or the rolling hills of Fife. His house might be of similar construction, a turf or clay-walled cottage, but it would likely be part of a larger, more structured village. He is not a clansman, bound by blood to a chief. He is a tenant farmer, perhaps a serf, bound by law and obligation to a lord. His master might be a powerful baron, a knight, or even a great monastery. This farmer's life is governed by the rhythm of arable farming, ploughing, sowing, and harvesting grain, primarily oats and barley, but also some wheat in the more fertile areas. In winter, the lowland farmer also faces cold, darkness, and hunger. His diet is also based on pottage and oatcakes, but the structure of his hardship is different. His greatest anxiety might not be a surprise raid from a rival clan, but the demands of his lord. After his own harvest was brought in, a huge portion of it would have been taken as rent. He had to pay his tithes to the church. He might be required to perform winter work, repairing the lord's mill, mending fences, or cutting firewood for the castle, even when he needed to be working for his own family's survival. His connection to the wide world is greater. The lowlands were more populous, more integrated into the trade routes of the North Sea, but his personal autonomy is far less. A quirky tidbit that highlights this difference is the run-rig system of farming, common in both areas but with different social implications. Fields were not held as private plots, but were divided into long, narrow strips. Each tenant in a village would be allocated a number of scattered strips. This was designed to ensure everyone got a fair share of the good and bad land. In the Highlands, this system reinforced the communal, kin-based nature of the settlement. In the Lowlands, it was a tool of manorial control, making it easier for the Lord's reeve or manager to oversee the work and collect the rents. The language you hear around you is Gaelic. The stories are of Gaelic heroes. If you were in a lowland cottage, you would be hearing an early form of the Scots language, a Germanic tongue more closely related to English. The stories might be of chivalrous knights or tales from the Bible, reflecting a culture more closely aligned with feudal Europe. Historians still argue about the precise location and nature of the Highland line, the cultural and linguistic frontier that divided these two Scotlands. It was not a formal border, but a fluid, shifting zone of interaction, and frequently of conflict. To the Lowlanders, the Highlanders were often seen as wild, lawless barbarians. To the Highlanders, the Lowlanders could be seen as soft, grasping, and untrustworthy. This division was starkly apparent in winter. The lowland lord in his stone castle with its large fireplaces, multiple rooms, and stores of grain taken from his tenants would experience winter in a profoundly different way from the people in his fields. His winter might be one of boredom and feasting. For the clan chief in the Highlands, while his tacksman's house or tower would be larger and better built than your longhouse, the fundamental connection to his people was closer. He was expected to provide for his clan in hard times, to lead them in defence. His survival was more directly tied to theirs. The lowland lord's relationship with his tenants was more purely economic. If a tenant family starved over the winter, it was a tragedy, but one that could be replaced by a new tenant in the spring. So while you shiver in this Highland longhouse, feeling at the very edge of the world, remember that your experience is only one half of the story. The peasant in the lowlands is also cold, also hungry. But the chains that bind him are different. His fear is not just of the cold, but of the reeve's knock on the door, demanding a share of the food he needs to keep his own family alive. He is part of a larger, more rigid machine, and winter is the time when the gears of that machine grind the hardest on those at the very bottom. In the suffocating darkness and isolation of the deep winter, you might think that the influence of great organised institutions would fade away. But one institution, above all others, retained its power. Its presence felt even here, in this remote and snowbound glen. That institution is the church. While the king's law may be frozen, God's law, and the authority of his church on earth, is ever present in the minds of the family. The family you are with is Christian. The historical fact is that by this period Scotland was, officially, a thoroughly Christianised country. The old pagan beliefs, like the worship of the Cailleach, might persist as powerful folklore, but the formal religion, the structure of belief and worship, was Catholic Christianity. Their lives were marked by its rhythms: baptism at birth, marriage in the church, and prayers for the dead. The calendar they loosely followed was the liturgical calendar, with its cycle of feasts and fasts. The Yule celebration you witnessed was a perfect example of this blend, a solstice festival seamlessly merged with the celebration of Christmas. However, the physical presence of the church in their daily winter life is minimal. The nearest place of worship is likely a tiny, stone-built parish kirk, perhaps miles away. The journey would be difficult in summer and is utterly impossible now. The priest assigned to this parish might be responsible for a huge, sparsely populated area. He would not be visiting them until the spring thaw. So, their faith becomes a personal domestic affair. In the evening after the storytelling, the old woman might lead the family in a simple prayer, a Pater Noster or an Ave Maria, recited from memory in heavily accented Latin. Their knowledge of Scripture would be limited to the stories the priest told in his sermons during his summer visits, and perhaps a few morality tales about the saints. Their relationship with the church is complex, a mixture of genuine faith, ingrained tradition, and a certain amount of resentment. The church offered immense spiritual comfort. In a world of such hardship and uncertainty, the promise of a heavenly reward for a life of suffering was a powerful solace. The belief that God and the saints were watching over them, that their prayers could be heard, provided a framework of meaning and hope in the face of random misfortune. When the young woman's cough gets worse, her mother's prayers become more frequent and more fervent. It is the one thing she feels she can do. But the church was also a powerful and demanding landlord. This is the other side of the coin. A tenth of everything the family produced, a tenth of their grain, a tenth of their calves and lambs, a tenth of their cheese, was owed to the church as a tithe. A quirky and often contentious detail was the tand, the Scots word for tithe, which was levied on almost everything. There were complex rules for how it was to be paid. For example, the priest was entitled to every 10th newborn animal. Imagine the heartbreak of having to give up a healthy lamb, vital for the future of your flock, to the church. The collection of these tithes was often relentless and unforgiving. While the priest himself might be a local man, the tithe supported a vast and wealthy institution, with powerful bishops and great monasteries, whose riches stood in stark contrast to the poverty of the people who paid for them. The burden of the tithe was felt most keenly in winter. The grain that was taken for the church in the autumn is grain that is not in their storage pit now. The animal that was given away is not providing warmth in the byre. This led to a kind of low-level, simmering anti-clericalism, not a rejection of the faith itself, but a deep-seated resentment of the wealth and greed of the institution. Stories would circulate, the same kind of gossip shared around the fire, about fat, worldly priests and hypocritical monks, a popular theme in folk tales across medieval Europe. Historians still argue about the depth and nature of piety among the rural peasantry. Was their religious practice driven by genuine, internalized faith, or was it more a matter of social conformity and a fear of supernatural punishment, both from God and from the priest, who held the power to excommunicate them? In all likelihood, it was an inseparable mix of both. The belief was real, but so was the resentment. They would pray to a saint for intercession, while simultaneously cursing the bishop who demanded their last sack of oats. So, as you sit in the Longhouse, you're witnessing this complex dynamic at play. The church is both an invisible comfort and an invisible burden. It provides the spiritual language for their hopes and fears, the names of the saints they call upon in the dark. But it is also a source of their material hardship, an institution whose demands make the already brutal calculus of winter survival even more difficult. The cross that might be carved into one of the roof beams is a symbol of both salvation and obligation. It's a constant reminder that even when they are completely cut off from the world, they are still part of a larger order, an order that offers comfort to their souls while demanding a heavy price from their bodies. The festive memory of Yule is now a cruel joke. The days are, in theory, getting longer, but the world outside remains a frozen white desert. The monotonous grind has entered a new and more terrifying phase. A subtle but profound change has taken place in the Longhouse. The conversation has dwindled. The storytelling has lost its energy. A heavy, anxious silence often fills the room, broken only by the wind, the sick girl's cough, and another, more frightening sound, the scraping of the bottom of the barrel. You're now entering the hungry gap. This was the most feared time of the year, the brutal stretch of late winter and early spring, February, March, April, when the food stores from the last harvest ran out, long before the new season's growth could provide any relief. It was a predictable, annual crisis, a bottleneck of starvation that every single person in this Longhouse has been dreading since the first autumn frost. The evidence of the coming famine is everywhere. The oat barrel, which once seemed reassuringly full, is now alarmingly low. The woman of the house, who once ladled out the pottage with a reasonably generous hand, now measures each spoonful as if it were gold dust. The daily ration has been cut. The thick, sustaining porridge of early winter has become a thin, watery gruel. You are constantly, gnawingly hungry. It's a dull, aching emptiness in your stomach that never goes away, making it hard to think, hard to sleep, hard to summon the energy for the simplest chore. The last of the salted meat is gone. The final, rock-hard piece of dried fish was boiled into a soup days ago. The pile of turnips in the corner has been reduced to a few rubbery, shriveled roots. The historical fact is that this period of seasonal starvation left tangible marks. Archaeologists and biohistorians examining skeletal remains from this era can see the evidence in what are called Harris lines, thin lines of increased bone density on the long bones that indicate periods where childhood growth temporarily stopped due to malnutrition, only to restart again when food became more plentiful. The teeth tell a similar story, with bands of enamel hyperplasia showing where the body's development was arrested by severe nutritional stress. The bodies of the people around you are living archives of past winter's famines. The family's focus turns to desperate measures. the man of the house might risk venturing out on a makeshift pair of snowshoes, checking the snares he set weeks ago in a sheltered patch of woodland, hoping against hope to catch a rabbit or a bird. But the animals are starving too, and the hunt is likely to be fruitless. The men might decide that they have no choice but to slaughter one of the precious sheep in the byre. It's a devastating decision. It's like eating your seed corn. That sheep represents future lambs, future wool, the future wealth of the family. Killing it is an admission of defeat, a sacrifice of the future for a few more days of survival in the present. A quirky and grimly practical source of food was blood. A family might bleed one of their cattle, making a small incision in a neck vein to drain a quantity of blood, then plugging the wound with a piece of clay. The blood, rich in protein and iron, would be mixed with the last of the oatmeal and fried on the girdle stone to make black puddings. This practice allowed them to get sustenance from their most valuable animals without actually killing them, a desperate act of sustainable harvesting. The physical effects of this prolonged hunger are becoming obvious. People are visibly thinner, their faces gaunt, their eyes sunken. They move slowly, listlessly, conserving every calorie. The children, usually a source of noise and energy, are quiet and subdued. The sick girl's condition is worsening. Her body, lacking the nutrients to fight the infection, is losing the battle. Tempers are short. The close confinement, which was once a source of communal strength, is now a pressure cooker of resentment. Small irritations flare into bitter arguments over a dropped piece of peat or a mouthful of gruel. Historians still argue about the social mechanisms that kicked in during a full-blown famine. When one family's food ran out entirely, would their neighbours, if they could be reached, share their own meagre stores, following the principles of kinship and community? Or did survival become a brutal individualistic struggle, with each household hoarding what little they had, letting their neighbours starve? The answer is likely both. Accounts from later famines describe incredible acts of self-sacrifice and charity alongside horrific stories of violence, theft and cannibalism. In the end, it depended on the severity of the crisis and the strength of the social bonds. The hunger is a physical and psychological torment. It dominates every waking thought. You dream of food. You hallucinate the smell of roasting meat. The world shrinks until it contains only this single, overwhelming reality. The emptiness in your stomach, and the terrifying knowledge that the food is almost gone. The Longhouse has become a waiting room of starvation, and you're all just waiting, listening to the wind, praying for a miracle, for the first impossible, incredible sign of spring. Just when you think the monotonous cruelty of the winter will never end, a change comes. It doesn't arrive gently. It comes with a violence that rivals the winter's own. You're woken one night by a new sound, not the crisp rustle of wind over dry snow, but a drumming dripping. Just when you think the miserable grey-white world will last forever, something raw. A warm, wet wind blowing in from the Atlantic has arrived. The temperature soars, the great changes. It's not a sudden, glorious transformation. It's a subtle, almost treacherous shift in the air thaw has begun, but it is not the gentle, hopeful event you had imagined. It is a new kind of disaster. A new sound joins the whisper of the wind, the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of melting. The first sign is the state of the Longhouse itself, the thick blanket of snow on the roof which acted as a surprisingly snow from the eaves of the Longhouse. A day comes when the sun has a hint of genuine warmth, and the blinding effective layer of insulation is now melting. Icy water begins to drip through the thatch, not just in one or two places. The white surface of the snow loses its pristine glare, becoming wet and heavy. The thaw has begun. But this is not the gentle but everywhere. The roof that kept you dry from the snow cannot handle the rain. The floor turns to a slick, cold, life-affirming spring of a poet's imagination. This is the treacherous, messy and dangerous spring thaw of the Scottish Highlands, a new chapter of misery all its own. The initial relief you feel is quickly replaced by a mud. Your bed of bracken becomes a sodden, stinking mattress. The oppressive smoke from the fire is joined new set of problems. As the immense blanket of snow begins to melt, the world dissolves into a brown, churning chaos by the clammy, miserable feeling of being perpetually damp. The fire itself hisses and sputters as drips land. The frozen ground, hard as iron for months, is unable to absorb the sudden deluge of water, the snowpack in the hearth, making it even harder to keep alive. Outside, the scene is one of chaotic transformation. The pristine that took 3 months to accumulate is now melting in a matter of days. The small, frozen burn at the bottom of the glen transforms. White world is dissolving into a grey and brown mess. The snow, which stood 6 feet deep in places, is collapsing from a silent ribbon of ice into a raging muddy torrent. It overflows its banks, turning the entire floor of the glen into a slushy, sodden mass. The burn, the frozen stream, is now a raging brown torrent, choked with huge chunks of ice that grind against each other with a sound like thunder. This is the historical fact of the into a shallow, fast-moving lake. The historical fact is that this spring flooding was as predictable and as dangerous as the winter Scottish spring thaw. It was a season of widespread and dangerous flooding, the water unable to soak into the still frozen ground snows. Settlements built on low-lying ground, or horves, were particularly vulnerable, and it wasn't uncommon for homes, livestock, and even people to be swept away in the deluge. Your longhouse beneath the snow pours off the hillsides, turning every gentle slope into a waterfall, and every gully into a river thankfully situated on a slight rise, is safe from the main flood, but it becomes an island in a sea of mud. The small patch of land around the longhouse becomes a quagmire, a sea of thick, clinging mud that, stepping outside the door, means sinking ankle-deep, or even knee-deep, in a thick, cold, clinging sludge. It's a mixture of melted snow, saturated peat, and, near the byre end, months of accumulated animal waste can pull the shoes right off your feet. This sudden deluge brings a whole new set of dangers. The foundations of the turf-walled longhouse, saturated with water, could become unstable. A part of the wall could slump or even collapse. That is now seeping out into the surrounding area. The smell is appalling. The clean, sterile cold of winter has been replaced by paths that are beginning to reappear are treacherous, slick with mud and ice, and the floodwaters bring a new wave of disease, the stench of decay and mud. Travel is just as impossible as it was in the deepest snow, only now the filth that has been frozen all winter, animal waste, refuse from the house, the carcass of an animal that died a battle against suction and filth instead of drifts. This wet, mucky environment is a paradise for disease. The in the snow is now picked up by the meltwater and washed into the community's water source. The risk bacteria that have been lying dormant in the frozen ground and in the waste from the byre now flourish in the damp, warming conditions of dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses skyrockets, just as the threat of respiratory disease from the confinement. The water sources, including the hole in the burn that you so painstakingly kept open, are now contaminated with runoff from begins to fade. It's replaced by the threat of gastrointestinal plagues, a quirky and particularly foul-smelling tid the entire landscape. This leads to a new wave of sickness. While the respiratory diseases of winter begin to fade, a bit of the thaw was the midden. All winter, the family's waste, along with the animal manure from the byre, are replaced by the gastrointestinal plagues of spring. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses that cause debilitating diarrhea was simply piled up outside the door. Now this frozen pile of filth, the midden, thaws into dehydration. For bodies already weakened by months of malnutrition, a bout of dysentery could easily be fatal. The sick young woman, a stinking semi-liquid heap, a perfect breeding ground for flies and disease, its runoff contaminating everything downstream. The annual who somehow survived the winter is now more vulnerable than ever. A quirky and rather disgusting tidbit from mucking out of the byre and the spreading of the midden on the fields was a vital part of the agricultural. This period is the task of mucking out. All the accumulated animal waste from the byre, which has been trampled into a thick semi-frozen mat all winter, must now be cleared out. It's a monumental, back-breaking cycle, but the initial thaw was a period of profound unpleasantness. The human cost of the winter is now becoming grimly apparent. As the snow recedes, it reveals the bodies of those who did not survive, a sheep that wandered off, and task involving wooden shovels and wicker baskets. This manure, however, is not waste. It is black gold. It will be spread on the fields as the primary fertilizer for the coming season's crops. The family's future harvest, and thus froze, a deer that starved in a thicket, and most grimly, perhaps the body of a traveller who their survival next winter depends directly on the mountain of dung they have been living with for the past 5 months. That was caught in a storm months ago, his journey ending just out of sight of shelter. The raider who was struck whole family, including the older children, would be involved in this smelly, exhausting work. Historians still argue about the impact down at the door, whose body was hastily buried in a snowdrift, is now reappearing. A gruesome reminder of the winter of the Thaw on the structural integrity of the turf and wattle and daub buildings. The constant dampness woods violence. Historians still argue about the precise death peak in pre-modern societies. Was it saturate the turf walls, making them heavy and prone to slumping? The daub, the mixture of mud and dung in the deep winter, from cold and respiratory illness, or during the treacherous spring thaw, from famine-weakened bodies, could be washed away by the constant dripping and runoff, exposing the woven wattle framework beneath. Spring was a time of succumbing to waterborne diseases. The data suggests both periods were incredibly lethal. The thaw was a time of profound paradox, frantic repairs. The roof would need to be rethatched where winter storms had damaged it. The walls would need to be patched. The battle against the elements simply changed its form. The fight against the cold became a fight against the wet. It held the promise of an end to the starvation, but for those whose immune systems were already battered by months of malnutrition, it was often the final straw. The sick girl in the Longhouse, who has clung to life so tenaciously. The psychological impact of the thaw is also complex. There is relief, certainly. The tyranny of the snow is broken. But it's an exhausted, weary relief, tempered by the grim reality of the world it reveals. The landscape is at her most vulnerable now. The damp chill is a terrible strain on her weakened lungs. You stand at the door of the Longhouse, looking out at a world being messily reborn. It's not beautiful. It's a landscape that emerges from under the snow as a sad, dead-looking thing. A palette of muddy browns and pale, lifeless yellows of mud, slush and debris. The air is full of the smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and the newly. The bodies of animals that didn't survive the winter, a lost sheep, a fox, a deer, are now exposed thawed midden. The feeling is not one of joyous relief, but of utter exhaustion, mixed with a dawning awareness of the in the fields. The ground is too soft and wet to begin ploughing or planting. The hungry gap is immense amount of work that lies ahead. The fields need to be cleared and prepared for ploughing. The house needs to at its most intense, because now you have the energy-sapping work of mucking out and repairs to do, but the food be repaired. The dead need to be properly buried. The winter monster is finally dying, but it is thrashing and its stores are at their absolute lowest. The promise of spring is there, but it still feels a long, long way off death throes, and you are far from safe yet. The thaw is not a gentle kiss of spring, it is. You stand at the door of the Longhouse, looking out at the muddy, waterlogged world, feeling a profound, a chaotic, dirty and dangerous battle, the final test of your endurance. Weeks have passed since the first violent thaw. The world is no longer a chaotic slurry of mud and floodwater. The ground has firmed up, the streams have retreated to their banks, and the air has lost its raw, damp chill. And then one day, you see it. On a south-facing bank, catching the full strength of the strengthening sun, is a patch of vibrant, impossible green. It's the first new growth of the year, a cluster of wild garlic or the tender shoots of young nettles. It's not a harvest, it's not a meal, but it is a miracle. It is the first edible thing to emerge from the dead earth, and it signals a true turning point. The collective sigh of relief in the Longhouse is a physical thing. The crushing, day-to-day anxiety that has been your constant companion for months finally begins to ease its grip. The sight of that first green shoot is a promise fulfilled, a confirmation that the cycle of life has not been broken, that the world is in fact coming back from the dead. The woman of the house goes out with a small knife and a basket and carefully harvests some of the nettle tops. They will be boiled and added to the watery oat gruel, providing the first fresh vitamins and minerals the family has tasted in half a year. To your modern palate, boiled nettles might sound like a punishment, but to these starving people, the taste is revelatory. It's the taste of life itself. This is the historical fact of the late spring. It was a time of intensive foraging. While waiting for the main crops of oats and barley to grow, people would scour the landscape for anything edible. They would gather sorrel, wild garlic, dandelions and chickweed. The children, with their sharp eyes and small hands, would be sent to search for the tiny edible roots of the pignut. a small starchy tuber that was a welcome treat. Every calorie, every nutrient was a precious gain. This wild harvest was the bridge that carried them over the final desperate weeks of the Hungry Gap. The light has changed completely. The sun is now a warm, welcome presence in the sky. It rises earlier, sets later, and the long oppressive nights are a fading memory. For the first time in months, the family can spend the majority of their day outside the smoky confines of the Longhouse. They throw open the hide flap, letting the fresh air and sunlight pour in, a natural act of spring cleaning that helps to drive out the lingering damp and sickness of the winter. The world is filled with the sound of bird song, another sign of the Great Return. The birds that fled south in the autumn are back, staking out their territories with a joyous, noisy confidence. Work begins in earnest. The man of the house and his eldest son are out in the small field, the in-by land closest to the house. They are not using a heavy horse-drawn plough. They may not even own a horse or an ox. Instead, they are using a cas-chrom, or foot plough, a traditional Gaelic implement. A quirky tidbit of agricultural history, the cas-chrom was perfectly adapted to the rocky, uneven soil of the Highlands. It consists of a long, curved wooden handle with a small iron tip. The user forces the tip into the ground with their foot, then levers the handle back to turn over the sod. It is slow, back-breaking work, but it allows them to cultivate small, awkward patches of land that a modern plough could never reach. As they work, they are preparing the ground for the most important crop of all, oats. The seed oats, saved from last year's harvest, are the family's hope for the future. Every grain is precious. The sowing would be done by hand, the sower walking across the newly turned earth, casting the seed in a wide, practiced arc. This moment is fraught with a tension all its own. They have survived the winter, but their survival next winter depends entirely on the success of this crop. A late frost, a summer drought, a blight, any of these could spell disaster. Historians still argue about the exact timing of the agricultural calendar in medieval Scotland, and how it was affected by the Little Ice Age. The shortening of the growing season meant that farmers had a much smaller window of opportunity. They had to wait for the ground to be dry enough to work, but they couldn't afford to wait too long, lest the oats fail to ripen before the first frosts of the next autumn. This climatic pressure must have created a constant low-level anxiety throughout the entire summer. The work was a race against time, a gamble against the sky. But for now, in these first warm days of true spring, the mood is one of guarded optimism. The cattle and sheep, looking thin and shaggy after their long confinement, have been let out to graze on the new grass. The children are running in the fields, their laughter a sound you haven't heard in months. The sick girl, who miraculously pulled through, is sitting in the sun by the door, still weak but with colour back in her cheeks. The land is greening, the air is warm, and for the first time you feel a sense of absolute certainty that the winter is truly over. The scars remain, but the wounds are beginning to heal. Life, tenacious and resilient, is returning to the glen. The green tide of spring has now fully washed over the landscape, replacing the grim browns and greys of the Thaw with a vibrant, almost shocking intensity. The birch trees are covered in a haze of new, bright green leaves. The gorse is ablaze with yellow flowers, their coconut-like scent filling the warm air. The frenetic work of ploughing and sowing is done, and for a brief moment there is a pause. It is a time for accounting, a time to formally and informally take stock of the winter's true cost. The survival of the household has been secured, but the price has been high. The first, and most grim, accounting is for the dead. The young woman who had been so sick, who seemed to rally in the first days of spring, suffered a relapse and died. Her body, weakened by months of malnutrition and respiratory illness, simply could not recover. There was no great ceremony. Her father and brother wrapped her in a simple woolen shroud and carried her to the small consecrated ground of the parish kirk, miles away. It was a quiet, sorrowful procession under a bright spring sky. You watch them go, a stark reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Her death leaves a hollow space in the small family, a permanent scar. This historical fact of staggeringly high mortality rates was not an abstract statistic. It was an intimate, recurring grief that shaped the emotional lives of every family. They were accustomed to loss, but that never made it easy. The accounting of the livestock is just as crucial. They count the flock of sheep. They lost one to the slaughter during the Hungry Gap, and another, a lamb, was born weak and did not survive its first few days. The cattle are thin but have survived. A major victory. The health of these animals is paramount. Their recovery on the fresh spring grass is watched with an eagle eye. They represent the family's entire capital, and their depleted numbers are a serious blow to the household economy. It will take a full season, maybe more, to rebuild the flock to its pre-winter strength. Then there is the accounting of the tools and the home itself. The winter has taken its toll on their meagre possessions. The man of the house inspects the blade of his axe, noting the nicks and the wear. A spade handle, weakened by the wet, has split and needs to be replaced. The thatched roof, which you remember dripping incessantly during the thaw, needs extensive repairs. A quirky but essential springtime task was rethatching. The whole family would be involved. The men would cut reeds or heather, while the women and older children would prepare it, tying it into bundles. Then, with practiced skill, they would work their way across the roof, weaving in the new material to patch the leaks and replace the rotten sections. It's a vital task to ensure the home is weatherproof before the autumn rains, let alone the next winter arrives. The community, which was so isolated, now begins to reconnect. A traveller comes through the glen, the first new face you've seen since last autumn. He brings news from the outside world, which lords are in favour with the king, what the price of salt is in the nearest burg, who has died and who is married in the next strath. The news of the failed raid on your Longhouse travels with him and becomes part of the local lore. The family's successful defence enhances their reputation for being tough and not to be trifled with. In a world with no formal police, a strong reputation was a vital deterrent. Historians still argue about the speed of economic and social recovery after a particularly harsh winter. Did communities bounce back quickly, or did a severe winter, like the one you've just experienced, create a spiral of debt and dependency that could last for years? If a family lost all their livestock, they might have to borrow from their chief or a wealthier neighbour, putting them in a subservient position. A failed crop could mean having to take on a loan of seed grain at a high rate of interest. A single bad winter could permanently alter the social standing of a family, pushing them from being independent farmers into a more precarious dependent state. As the days grow long and warm, you see the landscape itself being repaired. The scars of winter are slowly being covered over. The fields, now a carpet of bright green oat shoots, show the promise of the coming harvest. The family works with a steady, determined rhythm. They are leaner, harder, and quieter than they were in the autumn. They have been through a crucible and it has marked them. They do not talk about the winter much, but it's there in the way they look at the sky, in the way they carefully mend a tool, in the lingering sadness in the mother's eyes when she looks at the empty space where her daughter used to sleep. They have survived. That is their victory. But the cost is etched into their faces, woven into the fabric of their lives, and buried in the cold ground of the kirkyard. The accounting is complete, and the final tally is a heavy one. The sun now arcs high and warm across the sky, and the memory of the snow is like a half-forgotten nightmare. The days are long and full of life, the buzz of insects, the bleating of healthy lambs in the field, the steady greening of the oats. You have made it. You have survived a medieval Scottish winter. But as you prepare to leave this small glen, you look at the faces of the family, at the landscape, at the Longhouse itself, and you realise that the winter is never truly over. It has left indelible scars, not just on the land, but on the very soul of the people. You see it in their caution. They enjoy the warmth of summer, but they do not fully trust it. Every decision they make is shadowed by the knowledge that winter will return. The best cuts of wood are set aside for the Yule log. The strongest and healthiest lambs are marked for breeding to rebuild the flock. The woman of the house carefully dries the wild herbs she gathers, her mind already on the coughs and fevers of the coming darkness. This foresight, born of hard experience, is the most profound legacy of the winter. The historical fact is that this cyclical struggle forged a culture of profound resilience and pragmatism. You couldn't afford to be careless or short-sighted. You had to live in the present while constantly preparing for a hostile future. You also see the scars in their superstitions. The stories of the Cailleach and the sìth don't disappear with the snow. They are told on warm summer evenings too, reminders of the powers that rule the other half of the year. The family might leave an offering of milk or a piece of bannock on a particular stone, not out of immediate fear, but as a kind of down payment on goodwill, an appeasement of the forces that will hold their lives in the balance once more. The winter reinforces a worldview where the line between the natural and supernatural is thin, where the world is full of unseen forces that must be acknowledged and respected. A quirky and telling legacy is in the food. Even now, in a time of relative plenty with fresh greens and the promise of a harvest, the taste of salt and smoke is never far away. The first fish caught in the newly accessible streams are not all eaten fresh. Some are immediately salted and hung to dry, the beginning of the larder for the next winter. The process of preservation is not a seasonal chore. It's a constant underlying activity. This reliance on salted, smoked and preserved foods for a huge portion of the year shaped the Scottish palate for centuries. The national love for things like salted herring, kippers, smoked fish, Arbroath smokies, and even haggis, a dish designed to use up every last perishable part of an animal, is a direct culinary echo of these desperate times. The social fabric, too, bears the winter's mark. The bonds within the family, tested and strained by the confinement, have been forged into something stronger. They have faced the worst together and survived. The memory of the failed raid has hardened their relationship with their neighbours, reinforcing the us versus them mentality that was so central to the clan system. Loyalty to your own kin is absolute, because in the depths of winter, they are the only people you can truly rely on. Historians still argue how much the harsh, northern European climate, with its long, brutal winters, directly shaped the development of social structures, fostering intense communal loyalty within small groups while simultaneously creating deep suspicion of outsiders. The winter you experienced is a powerful argument for that theory. It was a crucible that burned away frivolities and left only the hard, essential bonds of kinship and mutual defence. You look one last time at the Longhouse. It's no longer just a primitive smoky hut. You see it now as a marvel of engineering, a living machine perfectly adapted to its environment. It is a ship designed to sail through the frozen ocean of winter. The thick turf walls, the central hearth, the shared space with the animals, every feature you once saw as a hardship, you now understand as a vital part of its genius. It is a symbol of the people themselves, tough, resilient, shaped by the land and the sky, and built to endure. The winter did not break them. It made them who they are, and so you walk away, back into your own time, leaving them to the long, beautiful summer they have so dearly earned. But you carry the winter with you, the memory of the gnawing hunger, the oppressive darkness, the biting cold, and the incredible, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. You understand now that to know Scotland, you cannot just see it in the sunshine. You must understand the darkness that has shaped its bones. The landscape around you begins to soften, the sharp edges of the medieval glen blurring and fading as our journey comes to a close. The visceral cold you felt in your bones is replaced by the comfortable warmth of your own bed, the rough texture of the wool cloak giving way to the smooth softness of your familiar sheets. The faint, smoky smell of the peat fire recedes, leaving only the clean, quiet air of your own room. The figures of the family, their faces etched with hardship and strength, retreat back into the shadows of history, their silent, enduring story now a part of your own. You can feel the immense distance of the centuries separating your world from theirs, a gap measured not just in years, but in the profound difference between a life of convenience and a life of raw, unfiltered survival. That constant gnawing hunger, the deep, penetrating cold, the ever-present threat of sickness and raids, these were not elements of an occasional adventure, but the very foundation of their reality, the rhythm to which their lives were lived year after brutal year. Allow yourself now to release the tension of their struggle, to let go of the anxieties that were not your own, but which you felt so keenly. Feel the deep sense of gratitude for the simple, miraculous comforts that surround you, the silent hum of electricity, the effortless flow of clean water, the reassuring solidity of the walls that protect you from the night. Let the story of that fierce, long-ago winter serve as a quiet reminder of the deep, resilient roots of the human spirit, its incredible capacity to endure, to create, to find hope and even joy in the very heart of the darkest, coldest nights. Let their story melt away into the background, becoming just a soft, distant echo as your own consciousness begins to drift, floating now on a much gentler current towards a place of deep, restorative and peaceful sleep, sweet dreams.